Chapter 808. On a cold autumn day in the mountains, there was still smoke from the battle. This was the battlefield chosen by the charter computer for the Iron 7th Division. It was desolate and uninhabited. The fierce battle had a relatively good ending at the end. Other than the forest that had been cut by shrapnel and the soil that had been blown up by the bombardment, Sulo was probably the only one who was satisfied with the outcome. However, at the moment he was too injured and weak to make any changes. The continuous days of battle had left countless wounds on his body, both inside and outside. These wounds were forcibly suppressed by the will of medicine and the jinchi in his body. Today, they finally erupted in full force in the battle against the terrifying Iron 7th Division. The moment he sensed the explosive shackles on his feet, the moment he felt the exhaustion and pain from the deepest part of his soul, along with the mental relaxation brought by the complete surrender quickly transmitted from the damaged parts of his muscles and joints to every nerve and finally to his brain. In an instant, his face became even paler. Li Feng looked at him expressionlessly and said, "Su Lo, in order to save you, I broke all the military discipline that I could, and even pointed at the head of a lieutenant general. If you dare to die now, guess what I will do to you? You know what? Back in the training base, I once argued with Du Shaoqing about whether one person could change the outcome of a war." Sulo looked at the black muzzle that had been aimed at him and smiled with difficulty. "Today, I wanted to prove to him that I was right, but I didn't expect to lose so completely. But it was a good fight." "I find that you are very similar to Du Shaoqing," Li Feng said. Su Le frowned in doubt and said, "I don't like Du Shaoqing's character. He always has a sullen face like I owe him a lot of money. Other than copying his sunglasses, I really can't think of anything similar to him." In the armored vehicle, the officer of the Iron 7th Division in charge of the escort heard Su Li's words and thought of his own division commander. His expression was very interesting, but then he immediately returned to being absolutely serious and indifferent. "I'm saying that you're as gully as that Iceman, Du Shaoqing." Li Feng roared at him angrily. "You're still in the mood to be cocky at a time like this." After a moment of silence, Sula said in a slightly hoarse voice, "No matter how boring the excuses of those big shots are, I have killed so many people without being tried by the court these days. No matter how it is tried, it will only be a death sentence. Those people deserve to die." Li Feng glared at the officer of the Iron 7th Division, who was enraged by his words, and said coldly, "Anyone who kills a tiger must die. In the end, it's just death. Why do you have to do this?" Sula shook his head tiredly. "From the capital to Harbor City, I've been watching you kill people. Good job. You know I don't really like you, but you are avenging the tiger. I can't just watch you die." Li Feng said coldly, "Death is nothing, but I think you definitely don't want to be wrongly accused of being a citizen of the Empire." "That makes sense." Su Lu slowly narrowed his eyes and said with difficulty, "I'm a citizen of the Federation when I'm alive, and a ghost of the Federation when I'm dead, as long as I'm not a hungry ghost." Li Feng cursed in a low voice and shoved the pasty nutrition bar that he had just opened into his dry mouth. Then he looked at him and asked with a frown, "Su Lo, have you ever thought that you might really be a citizen of the Empire?" "Don't talk nonsense." Su Lo answered vaguely, "If I were a citizen of the Empire, my mother, who has never left Donglin, not even Nashi, would definitely be the first to disagree. She would think, who the fuck is going to reimburse me for a one-night stand?" Li Feng felt that it was very reasonable and laughed out loud. While laughing, he pressed his fingers on the special handcuffs on their wrists. With a muffled groan, he pressed hard. A burst of energy burst out in the carriage, and the delicate mechanical spring of the special alloy handcuffs was deformed by this huge force and could not be opened anymore. The officers of the Iron 7th Division in the carriage looked at this scene in shock. One of the officers subconsciously looked to the front and saw that the key to the special alloy handcuffs was in the hands of the commander in front. However, from the looks of it, the key was probably no longer used. Looking at Su Li's puzzled eyes, Li Feng casually explained, "This way, no one should dare to try to kill you secretly." Hearing this explanation, Suli's cold chest suddenly felt a little warmer. He wanted to shrug, but found that he could not even do such a simple action with his current physical condition. He could only smile and look at the young colonel, who was like a small mountain. He thought to himself, this is really a proud and childish guy. The long stretch of troops drove towards the capital's special district. More than 10 black mechas silently followed beside a military vehicle. They strictly carried out the direct orders of Division Commander Xiaoqing. If the person in the vehicle tried to escape, or if Colonel Li Feng tried to help that person escape, they had the authority to directly blow the military vehicle into pieces, including Li Feng. Although there was the guidance of the federal military parameters and the ship was equipped with protective plates according to the other party's request, the smuggling merchant ship still suffered serious damage after passing through the giant warp hole. Therefore, when the negotiators of the Federation government finally agreed to the underground resistance group's visit to the capital ring under Mu En's emotional and even annoying request, they had already switched to the federal military warship. Until now, Mu En still did not understand why the other party suddenly agreed to his request, and just remained silent on the matter of meeting with Colonel Su Le. Naturally, he did not know that this was the intention of President Pobre. After going through so many things, the president was very willing to cordially receive the resistance group soldiers from the Empire and wanted the entire Federation to see the image of him shaking hands with the foreigners. Hui Chaosher did not care about these trivial matters. Still playing the role of Mu En's sidekick, she did not even show a trace of vigilance about the possibility of being betrayed by Mu En to the Federation. She only calmly watched the unfamiliar scene of the galaxy outside the porthole of the warship. It should be known that if Mu En told the accompanying Federation soldiers that the thin young man with short hair and a hat was the princess of the Empire, whose name shook the universe, and whose hands were stained with the blood of the Federation soldiers, the Federation government would definitely be very willing to pay all the price and give Mu En unimaginable returns. Hui Chaosher had entered the star sector of the Federation before, but this was the first time she had entered the capital ring of the other party. She narrowed her eyes, and a strong desire occasionally appeared in her calm eyes. She cherished all the time she had and compared the scene of the galaxy in front of her with the star map that the intelligence department had paid a huge price to obtain from Bermuda. Arriving at the Sylvan region through the Gary corridor, she had lived in the Sunset region for a period of time. During the long space journey, she had also passed through several important space checkpoints of the Federation. The princess of the Empire silently and carefully observed every detail, such as the diet of the ordinary people, the number of transportation tools, and their mental state. From that, she had determined the current economic situation of the Federation, the supply of social necessities, and the supply of ordinary energy. The more she looked, the more silent she became. She discovered a shocking fact from many details. The gap between the economic strength and the military potential of the Empire and the Federation was even greater than the intelligence department had estimated. As for the difference in the level of technology, one only needed to see that the Federation's warships could freely pass through the Gary corridor and the black ocean like solar blocks on the old moon base outside the window to easily come to a conclusion that made all the people of the Empire feel cold. That blue planet is S1. According to my father back then, this is the planet he saw in the universe that most resembles the human's ancestral planet that the ancestor of the Hua family once described. The middle-aged man, who had spent most of the long journey reading novels in the cabin, came to Hui Chaosher's side without anyone noticing. A wide-brimmed hat that was very much in the style of the northern region of the Empire covered his overly handsome face. I know what kind of true emotions are hidden under your silence right now. Master Fanwei smiled and said, "Perhaps my father saw the huge gap between the two sides back then, so he tried his best to stop the previous emperor from starting the Westwoods expedition and tried to use the seed plan to promote peace in this universe. Unfortunately, he failed in the end, and the seed plan completely changed in the hands of your father, Hui Fu Chai." It was unknown what kind of complicated emotions the Federation's war god Li Pifu, who was now sleeping behind Mount Feicheng, would have if he heard the words of Master Fan. Hui Chaosher silently looked at the blue planet in front of the warship and tightly pursed her lips. "But you don't have to worry too much. The Empire always has two advantages that the Federation can't approve. The first is population. In the end, any war is just a competition of reproduction speed. There is no difference between a war between humans and a war between monkeys. Master Fan probably had a way to ensure that his voice wouldn't be heard by the surveillance equipment on the warship. He leisurely said, "The second is the concentration of power. The Empire only has one voice, but the Federation has countless voices. The more desperate the war between the two sides is, the greater the impact of this difference will have." Of course, as a lover of literature, peace, and Schiller's novels, I am very unwilling to see this war reach this stage. White Chausher finally broke the silence and said with a slightly cold gaze, "I'm not worried about these things. I'm only worried about that guy who thinks he's a messenger of justice and was turned into a stupid rock by the Federation. Will he still risk his life for these foreigners? If he were to die so pointlessly, this adventure of mine would seem rather ludicrous." Praise the Creator. Fortunately, nothing really happened between the two of you back in the manor. Otherwise, if the plot in Master Schiller's 8 parts trilogy had been fulfilled, I would have sinned greatly. The great teacher gently closed his palms and looked at the blue planet that was getting closer and closer. His eyes were intoxicated by the huge, white snow cloud that spanned countless kilometers in the north of the planet. He praised, "Father, your description is right. It really is a big cotton candy." Chapter 809.
Dang, 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 dang.
Strong piano accents came from the television. As the piano song progressed, the sonorous melody became more and more solemn. It was as if black clouds had covered the sky of the city, and snowflakes were about to be painted the color of lead by the smoke. An extremely deep sense of crisis arose spontaneously. In this oppressive atmosphere, a low and solemn voiceover with a strong sense of compassion sounded. This is the last few years of the 36 constitutional calendar. The cruel imperial family has once again launched the extremely inhumane plan of forcibly crossing the space channel. The fierce space turbulence and the torsional data monitoring that they could not control made crossing the space channel an almost suicidal action. Usually, only 1 out of 100 spaceships could successfully cross the space channel, and the rest would all become tragic victims. However, this time, the cruelty of the imperial family was inflicted on themselves. Those spaceships that risked their lives to enter the space channel were all their own descendants. Finally, a spaceship was lucky enough to pass through the Gary corridor. Like a thief, it avoided the glory of the charter and quietly escaped into the Bermuda Triangle Star region. This spaceship was mainly responsible for the mission of transporting a baby. When this baby was imported into the Federation by the Bermuda Human Trafficking Organization, his luck became the beginning of the misfortune of countless Federation families. The kind Federation man who adopted the baby was surnamed Mai. He gave the baby the name Macklin. This documentary, produced by the Federal Military's Venus Documentary Studio, was called Seed of the Empire. It was directed by the famous director Bai Ziming. Today, it officially began broadcasting on the Federation's news channel. Along with the worrisome voiceover description, the television screen showed a scene of the innocent baby playing in a private house in the Federation, including the beginning when the Imperial spaceship forcibly broke through the space channel. These scenes were all done by the director's imagination. However, this did not affect the effect of the documentary. With just the beginning, it successfully captured the attention of all the Federation citizens. After years of silence, the government of the Federation began to decrypt the Empire's seed plan and told the people of the Federation about the Macklin incident. Although there were vague rumors about it in society, most ordinary people were still shocked speechless by the story described in the documentary. The old, white-haired senator, who had been almost forgotten by many people, was no longer a kind-hearted pacifist who had devoted his life to the reconciliation of the Federation but an evil executor of the terrible scheme of the Imperium. According to the description of the documentary, with the joint efforts of the former president, President Pabre, the Bureau of Proclamation, and the glorious Federal Army, the Federation government wisely saw through Medellin's sinister intentions before he attempted to bring the important data of the space passage back to the Empire. They killed him in the building of the Four States Peace Foundation, which was surrounded by mountains and mountains. At the same time, because there were still many seeds of the Imperium lurking inside the Federation, in order to avoid alarming them and the evil Imperium, the government carried out a strict intelligence blockade and did not inform the people of the Federation of this information. Until recently, when the Federation confirmed that the purge was completely successful, the operation was officially decrypted. In this documentary, of course, there were no images or words mentioning the death of the seed of the Imperium, Colonel Su Le, and another man named Shi Qinghai. On the terrace of the back mountain of Macho facing the lake, one could clearly see the reflection on the surface of the lake. On the opposite hillside, layers of green and yellow trees formed a beautiful picture that did not seem to belong to the human world. Secretary Shin stood behind the high-back chair and said softly, "Mr. Li Yuan Gong just called." He did not understand why the government chose this time to publicize this matter and wanted to ask what you think. That old man who likes to wear funny round hats is not an uncultured burlesque actor. It seems that pretending to be an old fool has become a habit. Lady Tai put the delicate silver spoon into the Guna porcelain plate, looked at the lake and mountains and said calmly, "The government needs to create momentum. They need an explosive news to attract the attention of the people and make them forget about the ancient clock ship incident. As for the Parliament Hill and the continuous assassinations, they need to be completely forgotten." Of course, with Pabre's real personality hidden in his body, now that he has been re-elected, he must be very willing to tear off Macklin's last coat and kick that dead man to the ground and then step on him. No matter how you look at it, Macklin is the most troublesome opponent he has ever encountered since he started his political career. The documentary did not mention Colonel Su Le. If he is really the seed of the Imperium, Shinli asked with an extremely humble attitude, since you want to manipulate the people's psychology, why not throw Su Le out as a target? It takes a process for the ordinary people to accept things, otherwise it is easy to have doubts or even reactions. Once they completely accept the fact that Macklin is from the Imperium, it will be much easier for them to accept it when they find out that the hero of the Federation is also from the Imperium. Pabre or other people who can influence or control the public opinion are actually doing the same thing. Feeding the people with delicious and non-dangerous information, just like the farm owner in Bermuda, cleverly and coldly controlling the amount of food he feeds. He wants to let the chickens eat enough to avoid making a fuss, but at the same time, he can't let them die of overeating. Of course, the most important thing is that he can't let those chickens find out that their fate is to be eaten by others. Lady Tai sneered slightly, put down the coffee cup in her hand, and said, "In my opinion, George Carlin has never really understood these problems. If the amount of information is too complicated, the ordinary people will not have the ability to distinguish what they need at all. They can only eat passively until they are fed, until they become idiots in the end." Shun Li stood silently behind his wife, recalling the similar arguments that had appeared in books before. He just felt that it was a bit strange for these words to come out of his wife's mouth. After a moment of silence, he said, "Now it seems that all the problems are focused on one point, whether Colonel Su Le is the seed of the Imperium or not." Lady Tai did not answer this question. She silently looked at the lake under the mountain in late autumn. The autumn feeling in the yellow forest in the lake reminded her of many things from many years ago. She said lightly, "What did old Tai say?" Old Director Tai said on the phone that he enjoyed his retirement life very much. He was very happy playing golf every day. He did not give his opinion on the Su Le matter, but in the end, he said, "An era is over." Shinli paused, looked at his wife's back, and said in a low voice, "Let him be. He is the only distant relative of the Tai family. It is good for him to rest more when he is old." But back then, he was always unwilling to have more sons, and instead adopted a bunch of daughters. I really don't know what he was thinking. Lady Tai certainly knew why the former director of the Bureau of Proclamation was unwilling to adopt a son from young to old. But she, who had always been grateful, did not want to point it out. As for the end of an era that old Director Tai mentioned, of course, he was not referring to Su Le. That era referred to the past of the Federation formed by the former president who truly cherished the Federation but eventually died of illness in office, the god of Warli Pifu, Lady Tai and her husband, the former director, and perhaps the man who is wandering among the stars. Following the strong rise of Pobre's government, the death of Zhong Suohu, and the impending death of Su Lo, a brand new era, one that no one could see the future clearly, and one that no one knew whether it was a good or bad era, had opened its curtains. Madame Tai stood up and left the balcony. Her back view still looked young, but it was unknown whether in this new era, she and the rulers of the big families still had the qualifications to stand behind the stage and enjoy the performances under the spotlight or just coldly watch from the sidelines. In the late autumn, a closed-door secret hearing was being held on Parliament Hill. Other than the hundreds of members of the management committee, even their closest subordinates were forced to leave. This secret hearing had nothing to do with the documentary and had nothing to do with Macklin, who had already been thrown into the abyss. It was only related to a colonel of the Federation named Su Le. Parliament Hill had just started, but it was already in an extremely intense debate, or rather, quarrel. A few male members of the parliament directly launched vicious personal attacks on the National Security Advisor, who had just finished reading the government report on the stage. Colonel Su Le is a hero established by the Federation government and a trusted aide strongly protected by your president. At this time, you actually want us to believe that he is actually a citizen of the Empire. Do you think that we are crazy, or are you crazy yourself? The people don't know who killed Macklin, but you don't know? Have you forgotten who killed the Butcher County King of the Empire? Mr. National Security Advisor, I really want to know if your shiny head is filled with artificial egg white. Sitting at the highest point of the stage, Mr. Zion, the vice chairman, was clearly unable to control the situation that was currently out of control, and it seemed that he had no intention of controlling the situation. The old chairman stroked the white hair on his forehead, thinking about the situation that had taken a turn for the worse in recent days. He knew that his hopes of Su Le blowing up the storm and becoming the vice president, or even the president of the Federation, had been completely shattered. Thinking that his days were numbered, it was already difficult for him not to show disappointment on his face. How could he have the mood to care about anything else? The members who were angrily criticizing the government, the president, and mocking the National Security Advisor did not admire Colonel Su Le and were even incomparably disgusted or fearful. Today, there were several empty seats on Parliament Hill, reminding the people from time to time that the owners of these seats had died under the guns of Su Le and his companions. However, as Li Feng said to Du Shaoqing, no one in the Federation believed that Su Le was a citizen of the Empire, and neither did the members of the Parliament. The shocking demonstration not long ago had directly caused Pobre's government to become more powerful. Parliament Hill, which had been forced to remain silent for too long, did not hesitate to seize the government's extremely stupid mistake and launch a counterattack. Pay attention to your demeanor. At the same time, improve your logical judgment. At this moment, the situation represented that the government and a considerable number of members of the parliament were about to shed all pretense of cordiality. The National Security Advisor no longer cared about anything and slammed the seat in front of him with a livid face, reprimanding loudly. Why can't a hero of the Federation be a spy of the Empire? Macklin was a member of the Federation elected by the people, so he is a citizen of the Empire. The noise on Parliament Hill gradually weakened. Some of the members began to seriously consider a certain possibility, regretting that they had reacted too quickly and acted too exaggeratedly. Chapter 8:10. Councillor Eva was the daughter of a miner from the Eastwood district. She had no background and was known for her isolation in Parliament Hill. Last year, during the hearing on the Federation's arrest of Su Le, it was she who first questioned Councillor Paulson, who had died in the hospital building. Colonel Su Le is the same as President Pobre. He is the pride of the Eastwood district. Now you are saying that the boy from Eastwood is from the Empire. I cannot accept it emotionally. Councillor Evo looked at the National Security Advisor in front of her and said, I want evidence. I want impeccable evidence. Otherwise, I will fight you to the end. The National Security Advisor looked at her and answered after a moment of silence. He knew that this female counselor was a staunch supporter of the president in Parliament, so he answered with a very polite tone. The Bureau of Proclamation is arranging for the second confirmation of the evidence. If the counselors are willing, the government welcomes you to supervise the whole process. What the president means is that since we want to accuse a hero of the Federation, the relevant evidence must be believed by everyone, including Su Lu himself. One day in late autumn, countless dark-colored cars drove slowly into the Bureau of Proclamation along the straight, dead-end road in the suburbs. These cars included councillors from Parliament Hill, civilian representatives who had signed temporary confidentiality agreements, senior reporters from various authoritative and serious media outlets, as well as senior officials from the government and many important generals from the military. President Pabre was there in person, and the 7 families had sent their most trustworthy representatives. The Bureau of Proclamation had the highest level of security among all the organizations in the Federation. It was even higher than the president's official residence. It was usually heavily guarded, and today the atmosphere was even more oppressive and tense. Most of the leading figures of the Federation were gathered here. If the Empire had the ability to cause a big explosion at this time, it was not an exaggeration to say that the Federation would definitely be in chaos. This was a very old-fashioned way of describing it, but it was very suitable for today's situation. Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood stood below the Bureau of Proclamation building, looking at the box-like building that was too regular in shape. As members of the news industry, this was the first time they had the opportunity to enter the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. They should have been excited to record everything they saw, but at this moment, their emotions were extremely complicated and heavy. After most of the people were invited into the building of the Constitutional Bureau, several bulletproof military vehicles drove over at high speed. Under the protection of several armed military police officers, Zhou Yu and Shang Qiu jumped out of the military vehicles with handcuffs on. From the outside, the 2 women didn't suffer much from the government's secret investigation. After all, one of them was the daughter of the former Minister of Defense, and she had been invited by that lady again in recent months to have tea together. The other was one of the best genius engineers in the Federation, the chief technical director of the giant corporation Nutshell Mobility. No matter which investigation department it was, they had to be polite to them. The government specifically asked them to come and watch the comparison of biological markers, which vaguely revealed some kind of message. It seemed that the president or General Li Jiedu hoped that they would wake up after seeing the real face of Su Lu and not fall deeper and deeper into the wrong path. This was a very old-fashioned way of saying, but it was very appropriate to describe the government's attitude toward the 2 women who were still very valuable. Su Lu was a war hero of the Federation and an idol in the hearts of the people. Suddenly, he was accused of being a spy of the Empire. For such a major incident, there must be enough strong evidence. Therefore, President Pabre did not hesitate to agree to the second comparison of biological markers. He intended to use this incident as an opportunity to quickly stabilize the unstable political situation due to the recent series of incidents. He intended to integrate the power of the Federation and let the word unity enter the hearts of the people again. The last vehicles to arrive at the Bureau of Proclamation were a dark green military vehicle and a black vehicle without any markings. The vehicles stopped under the stone steps. General Li Jiedu walked out of the military vehicle and looked at the black vehicle in front of him calmly and gently. The door of the black vehicle slowly opened. A pale and thin young man walked out, holding a small metal box tightly in his hands. The white-haired butler Jean looked at him worriedly and said, "Young master, why don't I take it?" Tai Ziyuan shook his head and carried the small metal box to the Bureau of Proclamation. The box was not heavy, but he held it very tightly with his hands, wearing anti-slip white gloves. This was because there was a bottle of blood in the box that he had personally gone to the military prison of Qingcheng and drawn from that guy. This bottle of blood could not determine whether Su Lu lived or died, but it could affect the political situation of the entire Federation. However, for Tai Ziyuan, the importance of this bottle of blood was that it could prove something that was more important than life and death in the eyes of some people. The internal protection of the metal box was extremely sophisticated and advanced. Even if it fell from dozens of meters to the ground, the things inside would not be damaged. However, this box was too important to Su Lu. It involved too many things. He only trusted Tai Ziyuan, and Tai Ziyuan only trusted that it would not be replaced by someone else. Until now, although no one believed that the Federal Central Computer could be wrong, people like Macho and the Back Mountain, who had used the internal staff of the Bureau of Proclamation more than once, still believed that the last biological marker comparison was most likely done by the Bureau of Proclamation under the orders of the government. For the opposite reason, Li Jiedu personally went to the military prison of Qingcheng and supervised the entire process of Tai Ziyuan drawing Su Li's blood. As for Macklin's biological marker, it had always been stored in the core backup of the Federal Central Computer. Macho and the Iron Mathematician had also secretly stored a copy after the Macklin case broke out. No one could fake it. The people walked into the Bureau of Proclamation building. After a long time, the people walked out of the Bureau of Proclamation building. At this moment, a cold autumn rain fell, without warning. The people of high status had their own escorts holding up umbrellas. In an instant, black flowers bloomed in the square in front of the building, covering the people's faces. The true emotions on their faces could not be seen clearly. The wide and straight road leading from the Bureau of Proclamation to the outside world was once again occupied by all kinds of dark-colored vehicles. Most of the vehicles were black. The cold autumn rain pitter-pattered on the vehicles, and the tires rolled up a thick layer of mist as they whizzed away. It was as if they had just attended a sad funeral. When the funeral was over, the people left in a hurry, not wanting to be tainted with any bad luck. Tai Ziyuan, who was the last to arrive, was still the last to walk out of the Bureau of Proclamation building. His thin and pale cheeks were stained with an unhealthy red. The two hands that were not carrying the small metal box waved irritably. He refused the umbrella that Butler Jean extended over his head and walked down the stone steps. He walked into the rain, letting the cold autumn rain soak his body from top to bottom. In addition to the important people in the Bureau of Proclamation building, in the distant end of the vast universe, on the Mo Hua planet at the center of the battlefield, some people almost simultaneously knew the result. According to President Pobre's personal order, the Bureau of Proclamation specially set up a multi-encrypted information channel to synchronize the image of the biological marker comparison to the Mo Hua planet. In a certain office in the Federation base, all the high-ranking officers of the new 17th Division, including Commander Qinghai and all the members of the first 7 teams, collectively watched the scene. The Federation government had no choice but to do this. After the battle between the Iron 7th Division and the Little White Flower MXD in the wilderness, their accusation that Su Lo was a spy for the Empire spread uncontrollably within the army, even to the front lines of the Empire. The soldiers respected heroes like Su Lo, who did not fear death the most. Even the Iron 7th Division could not bear to do it in the end, let alone the other soldiers. Of course, under the strict discipline of the Federation Army, the morale of the various troops was shaken, but it was not too big of a problem. Only the reaction of the new 17th Division was particularly strong. From Commander He Lei to Hua Xiaoxi, from Lin Ai to the ordinary soldiers, not to mention people like Xiong Linquan and Gu Shifeng, they firmly believed that this was the most shameless and dark persecution of the Federation government. They even began to pick up their guns, preparing to forcibly board the warship and kill their way back to the capital ring to save people. In such a terrifying situation, the Federation government had to use ironclad evidence to intimidate these fearless soldiers at the first possible moment. The room full of people was deathly silent. Only the sound of countless rapid breathing could be heard. In order to see the snowflakes caused by the long-distance signal transmission, Commander He Lei's eyes were already a little bloodshot. However, in the end, they only turned into despair. He breathed heavily, tore open the collar of his military uniform, and wanted to pick up the cup to drink water, only to find that the water in the cup had long been emptied. Commander Yu Qinghai had always maintained his silence regarding the incomparably intense reaction of the soldiers in the past few days, to the point of preparing to kill their way back to the capital ring. As a veteran of the generation of military god Li Pifu, he always insisted that what the army needed were not ice-cold killing machines, but great men full of hot-blooded vitality and injustice. Moreover, he was the same as his subordinates. He believed that the accusation of spying for the Empire was definitely another disgusting plot by the Federation politicians, but the truth was not so. All right, everything is over. Return to your respective combat positions and prepare to fight against the Empire's people. Of course, you have to mentally prepare yourself for the military trial, Commander Yu said in a low voice. The wrinkles on his face seemed to have deepened a bit. Don't be a sissy. Xiong Lingquan stood up with a gloomy expression. He stared at Gu Shifeng, who was tugging at her hair in frustration, and roared, "In any case, I don't believe it." He looked at his comrades in the room and waved his arms angrily. Boss has led us to fight so many battles. When has he not charged at the very front? Who has he killed less Empire people then? He is our boss. Your instructor. How can someone like him be from the fucking Empire? Xiong Lingquan angrily slammed the door and walked out. A moment later, a howl of venting came from outside the door, followed by the sound of countless bullets tearing through the sky. Chapter 811. This incident that was destined to shake the entire Federation was forcefully determined in the direction of development in the Bureau of Proclamation. The pale and skinny prince walked in the cold rain with an indifferent expression. No one knew that an equally pale and skinny guy was sent to a military psychiatric hospital in the Southern Hemisphere because of another incident that was destined to shake the entire universe, but was forcibly buried in data fragments. His pale eyes were bloodshot, and his eye sockets were deeply sunken. At this moment, Biderman looked like a street trash who had overdosed on drugs. Because of the hysterical experience in the Bureau of Proclamation, he had a lot of suspicious little actions. For example, his lips would tremble at a high speed from time to time, and he would often open his 10 skinny fingers and move them from top to bottom in front of him, mimicking a waterfall falling down. I'm not crazy. Biderman curled up in the chair weakly. Looking at the doctor in front of him, his eyes were full of pride and sadness. The charter computer came back to life. I saw it with my own eyes, but then I saw with my own eyes she was killed. From the beginning to the end, this genius with a terrifying sense of the mechanical language insisted on calling the intelligent old thing her. Now, when he talked about the death of the great mechanical wisdom, he couldn't help but show a sorrowful expression on his face. The doctor listened calmly with a smile and simply took down the medical record. After walking out of the ward, the doctor whispered a few words to the strong male nurse. Then, he smiled at the young lieutenant colonel in front of him and said, "This is a military hospital. Since you've handed him over to me, you can rest assured." The officer said seriously, "The person inside has made a great contribution to the Federation, but he knows too many things. You must take good care of him." "Understood. I'll let him enjoy his old age here." The doctor smiled and replied, "I'll inform you immediately if there are any problems." The officer raised his right hand and saluted. He thanked the doctor for his hard work and left the psychiatric hospital that was far away from the bustling world and filled with the smell of drugs that even he wanted to escape. The doctor looked at the back of the officer and smiled gently. Then he looked into the ward through the observation window on the door. On the other side of the thin glass, Biderman, who was put on a restraining gown by the strong male nurse, was screaming in horror. "I know. There's chlorpromazine in the syringe. Don't give me that. I don't want it. I beg you, don't give me this. I don't want to become an idiot." Because of fear, Biderman's weak body struggled on the bed. He looked like a pitiful fish that had been thrown into the desert. He begged, "I know I was wrong. I'm not mentally ill. I don't know anything. That guy has never been alive.
Please let me go."
The doctor looked at this scene through the glass. He watched as the sharp needle slowly pierced into the man's pale skin. Hearing the shrill screams coming from behind the door, the smile on his face became even gentler. In the deepest part of Qingcheng military prison, the special forces directly under Small Eye's unit surrounded and monitored the cell with the strictest security measures. They were always on guard against the two people inside breaking out of the prison. Although the Qingcheng military prison was filled with the most heinous and bloody criminals of the Federation, and the security measures should be flawless, every time they thought of the rumors about the two people in the prison cell, Everyone, from the warden to the elites of the Federation who had been trained in the Philadelphia Training Center, could hardly control the nervousness in their hearts. Yes, there were two terrifying people in the same cell. After Su Lo was seriously injured and arrested by the Iron 7th Division, Madman Li directly crushed the precision lock of the special alloy handcuffs with his strong finger strength. The two people's bodies were always connected by the handcuffs. Without the key, it was naturally impossible to open them, and he would not allow anyone to try to open them. They ate, received treatment, bathed, went to the toilet, and slept. They were together all the time. Madman Li stayed by Su Li's side every second. His vigilant and ruthless eyes scanned the surroundings because he believed that the Federation government, who dared to design such a shameless plot, would definitely do everything possible to secretly kill Su Lo. Madman Li had the bad temper of a standard soldier. He absolutely could not tolerate such a thing happening, and he could not let the only sister-in-law in the world who truly loved him become a widow before she was married. During these days in Qingqing prison, Madman Li stayed by Su Li's side. He stayed in this dark cell like he was guarding the position of the army, not giving an inch of ground. Even a vicious tiger would not eat its own cubs, but in the end, it was eaten. Uncle Zhong was killed by them, just like that. I want to see if that old bastard will kill his only son. Li Feng sat on the bed with a cigarette in his mouth. He stared coldly at the Special Forces soldiers with serious expressions outside the cell. He thought of his father who had just left the prison, and his voice was extremely cold. The anger and frustration hidden in the young colonel's terrifyingly burly body was clearly captured by Su Lo. He knew very well why. Madman Li, who had left home at a young age and spent his entire adolescence in the front line of the West Woods, had always regarded the tiger as his closest elder and even a father figure. However, the mastermind behind the explosion of the ancient bell, the real murderer who killed Commander Zhong, was his biological father. What could he do? Yuan, that bastard, he actually took so much of my blood just now. He didn't even think about the fact that I haven't recovered from my injuries yet. I could have been killed by him directly. Su Lo, who was holding a cigarette, smiled and changed the topic. However, when he thought of Tai Ziyuan's dignified expression, his fingers trembled slightly, and the ashes of the cigarette fell on the bed sheet. At this moment, in the Bureau of Proclamation building of the capital's Special Administrative Region, the second biological marker comparison was being carried out. Su Lo never thought that he was a citizen of the Empire, but he couldn't help but feel nervous. As Madman Li once said, death was not terrible, but being wrongly accused of being a citizen of the Empire was unacceptable. Once accepted, it was equivalent to surrendering to the conspiracy of the government. Because of Li Feng, his second stay in the Qingqing military prison was not too difficult. Although the crime this time was more horrible than assassinating a member of the parliament, he was satisfied with all kinds of living conditions, whether it was a hot bath or a cigarette. After all, since the prison couldn't get rid of Li Feng, of course, they wouldn't dare to treat the only son of Chairman Li unfairly. After taking a deep puff of the cigarette, Su Lo narrowed his eyes and looked at the late autumn sky outside the window. He was wearing a warm cotton thermal jacket. Because of the handcuffs, he couldn't put his left hand into the sleeve and could only drape it. Perhaps it was because of this reason that he felt a little cold. Noticing Su Li's strangeness, Li Feng's delicate eyebrows slightly raised. There was a trace of mockery on his face as he said, "Are you afraid of death? You should know that during the war period, those who assassinate the president are traitors. You deserve to die. The president and your father killed Commander Zhong, but it could arouse the anger of the people of the Federation. They could use this opportunity to start an all-out war against the Empire. So, they are not traitors? If I could really kill the president last time, I could actually push the blame to the people of the Empire." With the cigarette in his mouth, Su Lo said vaguely, "Didn't they say that I'm from the Empire? According to their logic, President Pabre should have sacrificed himself. The assassination of the President of the Federation by the people of the Empire is much more fierce than the ancient bell incident. The people and the troops will be aroused, and the Federation will definitely win the biggest victory on the battlefield. Just when Li Feng was about to praise Su Le for slapping the face of the Federation government, the phone in his pocket rang. He picked it up immediately and didn't avoid Su Le. After hanging up the phone, Li Feng turned his head and looked at Su Le with a very complicated expression. After a very long silence, he said with a slightly hoarse voice, "The result is out." Su Le narrowed his eyes. "You really don't know that you are from the Empire?" Li Feng withdrew his gaze and looked at the cigarette between his lips with white smoke in silence. He was very focused. Su Le suddenly opened his eyes. On his seemingly calm face, the pair of thick black eyebrows that were as straight as knives dangerously raised. His pupils that were usually full of sincerity and trustworthiness constricted in a very short time and then slowly relaxed. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. The dark cell fell into a deathly silence. The long and boring time that seemed to be about to freeze moved slowly in the silence until Li Feng's slightly cold voice sounded again. "It was in this prison that Grandpa met you for the first time. You should remember that I promised him in front of you that if one day you dare to betray the Federation, I will definitely kill you with my own hands." Su Le still didn't answer. His feet retracted back onto the bed, and his back leaned against the wall. He looked indifferently at the black bloodstains left behind by a dead fly in the summer on the snow-white wall. It was unknown what he was thinking about. "Su Le, I've never liked you. You might be a good person, but you are definitely not a good soldier. You often mess around, but I have to admit that I never thought that you would betray the Federation. So I never understood why Grandpa would say those words so seriously back then." Madman Li took a deep drag of the cigarette and licked his lips with the tip of his tongue. After a short pause, he continued, "Now I have a general understanding. Perhaps Grandpa knew about this before anyone else." Su Le still leaned against the wall. His eyes didn't close, and his thick eyebrows that were like knives gradually relaxed. He just looked across in silence and didn't say anything. "I believe that you don't know that you are a citizen of the Empire. Of course, you have never betrayed the Federation. But since the blood of the Empire's royal family flows in your body, this in itself is a type of betrayal." Madman Li threw the cigarette, but that had already lost its flavor to the ground. He turned his head to look at the indifferent face that was extremely close to him and said, "I won't kill you with my own hands because you are a good person." "No, there are no good people in the Empire." "Fine. Even if you are a citizen of the Empire, you are definitely not a spy for the Empire. This reason should be enough." Hearing these words that were clearly somewhat illogical and ridiculous, Su Le turned his head to look at him. The corners of his lips moved, and he laughed in an extremely ugly manner. "Let's go." He laughed as if he was crying. Chapter 8:12. Hearing the words, "let's go," Madman Li was silent for a long time before he nodded. The two of them sat side by side on the bed with their backs against the wall of the cell. They casually raised their handcuffed hands, Su Li's left hand and Li Feng's right hand, and exerted force in opposite directions at the same time. The special alloy handcuffs that had handcuffed the two of them for many days had long been broken. Even if there was a key, it couldn't be opened. However, under the seemingly casual tugging of the two young men on the bed, the handcuffs began to creak and gradually deform. A crisp sound of metal breaking echoed in the quiet cell. The thick alloy handcuffs specially made for Su Le were torn apart by the two men just like that. Only a round handcuff was left. It kept rotating on the two men's wrists, gradually digesting the terrifying force they had just endured. The cold light of the broken handcuffs flashed from time to time. Several elite Special Forces soldiers of the Federation who had been guarding outside the cell saw this scene, and were so shocked that their bodies stiffened. Their pupils constricted, and they fell into a state of confusion for a long time. It wasn't until Li Feng walked to the door with a livid face that they reacted and opened the door more cautiously than before. Looking at Li Feng's burly and strong back that gradually disappeared into the depths of the corridor, and looking at Su Le who was in a daze as he looked at the fly's corpse and black blood on the wall again, These elite Special Forces soldiers who had received close combat training in Philadelphia's body training hall still found it hard to believe that there was actually someone in this world who could break apart such hard alloy handcuffs. And they only used the strength of one hand. Was this a human or a machine? Until now, the elite Special Forces soldiers completely agreed with the rumors in the army. Su Lu and Madman Li were, without a doubt, the two most powerful men in the Federation. However, their situation now was completely different. Li Feng could leave this prison at any time, but Su Lu could only sit silently in the cell and wait for the arrival of death. Su Lu leaned against the wall and sat on the bed. He slightly tilted his head and stared at the white wall in a daze. With his eyesight, he could even clearly see the tiny wings on the dried corpse of the fly between the black congealed blood stains. It seemed that this disgusting and pitiful fellow was still futilely trying to escape when he was beaten to death by the previous owner of this cell in the summer. Why flee? As a fly, your fate is either to die in a cesspool or to die on the way to find a cesspool. What's the point of escaping from one cesspool to another? Su Lu closed his eyes tiredly. Hearing the hurried footsteps outside the door, he guessed that it must be the Qingcheng military prison who came to give him some measures. He understood that Madman Li had chosen to directly break the alloy handcuffs because he wanted to silently tell the prison that such a method would not be able to restrain his strong and powerful hands. Regarding this, Su Lu did not have any resentment or disappointment in his heart. On the contrary, he felt that it was natural. Since he had confirmed that he was a citizen of the Empire, Madman Li would certainly not give him the chance to escape. If it were him in the past, he would certainly have made the same decision. The heavy and hard alloy door of the cell silently slid open. Several prison staff members walked in with nervous expressions. First, they crouched down and increased the suction force of the heavy magnetic shackles on Su Li's feet to the maximum. Then, they fastened 3 sets of reinforced handcuffs on his wrists. There was a metal bracelet on his left wrist and a broken handcuff. Now there were 3 more sets of handcuffs. They were densely stacked together. Occasionally, there would be a crisp sound of metal clashing. It looked as beautiful as those thin bracelets on the wheat-colored, delicate forearms of the S3 Flowing Fire Festival. If it was last time in the Qingcheng military prison, Su Lu would definitely laugh. But now, he did not want to laugh. Even his posture did not change. He completely ignored these people. Only when the prison doctor tried to inject him with some kind of drug did he turn his head to look at the other party. He did not stop the doctor from injecting. He just looked. After an unknown amount of time, Su Lu, who was like a stone sculpture, finally woke up from the inexplicable state caused by the violent psychological impact. His gaze was still indifferent and emotionless. His thick eyebrows, which were sometimes like unsheathed straight knives and sometimes like laughing willow branches, were still indifferent and lazy. His posture was still the same, but his brain had finally recovered some ability to think. People of the Empire. He was a person of the Empire. When did he know that there were not only people from the East Woods, West Woods, Upper Woods, there were also people of the Empire? Like wringing a wet towel, Su Lu racked his brain, trying hard to recall many memories of his childhood. He even frowned, but still could not remember anything more. He only vaguely remembered that when he was young, his father used to read the newspaper at the dining table, lamenting about the cruelty of the people of the Empire. And when his father used the people of the Empire to scare little Xianyi, his mother would fly into a rage, and his father would immediately apologize with a smile. Now, he actually rarely recalled his childhood life because it was too long ago. When the terrible shallow mine disaster that caused half of the mining area to collapse happened, he was still very young, so he did not have many clear memories. Because he went to the slag heap with Victor and the others to play mecha battle games, he was extremely lucky to survive. However, his father, who worked in the underground mine, died. His mother and little Xianyi, who were at home on the surface, also died. Victor's family was also dead. Xiao Chong's father was also dead. Donglin had a bunch of orphans. Other than that, nothing had changed. The children, who cried until their throats were hoarse, could only watch helplessly as the engineering mecha lifted the heavy quick-setting cement blocks in vain. The scene was extremely sad and chaotic. Su-lo could not even find the bodies of his parents. He only held the body of his sister, Xian-yi. He still remembered how cold that small and cute body was. Yes, little Xian-yi's small grave was still on the hillside outside of the East Woods. He felt very ashamed that he had not gone back to see it for so long. This was also the reason why he did not want to recall his childhood. What about the people of the Empire? Su-li's thick eyebrows were more and more furrowed. He stared at the wall, but did not know where to look. He remembered that the first time he saw what the people of the Empire looked like was on the TV news. It seemed to be a documentary, talking about the only official visit of the Empire in history. The voiceover of the male commentator of the Federation was full of a sense of superiority that looked down on the inferior races. Every 3 minutes, he would mock the Empire people in the diplomatic mission, as if they would never smile. As for Su-lo, he only remembered that the people of the Empire on the TV were not like what his father said. They were not covered with scary long hair from head to toe, including their faces. So he thought of his dead family and secretly ran to the abandoned mine to cry. Where was the first time he saw a living person of the Empire? It should be on the Westwood's border planet called 5460. At that time, he took Jian Shuier and fled under the pursuit of the Empire's Wolf Fong Mecha Brigade. The first time he met the people of the Empire was a life and death battle. As for the dead people of the Empire, he had seen too many of them. The sun outside the window slowly sank into the distant horizon, and the light became much dimmer. Qingcheng Military Prison was not as cold as the capital at this time, but Su-lo, who was sitting on the bed leaning against the wall, seemed to be frozen, allowing the twilight to appear and disappear on his face. The darkness of night covered the earth, but he did not move at all, only remaining silent. Silence, silence. He did not become perverted in silence. He was only indifferently recalling and thinking about many things. Many things that he could not understand in the past gradually became a clear function curve in his mind. Although he did not know what the variables at the beginning of this function curve were, some segments of the curve were gradually beginning to reveal the answer. For example, why in the entire Federation, other than the people of Old Li's family, he was the only one who could learn the special abilities of the Empire's royal family. For example, why that man who wandered among the stars actually stayed in Donglin for so many years and appeared so coincidentally by his side. It should be known that in the real world, there was never a fortuitous encounter like in novels. There must be an internal reason for small probability events. The descendants of the rich were rich, and the legendary were legendary. The story of starting from scratch, the story of a foolish boy meeting a wise master, could only be a story in the end. Then, was it also a conspiracy that he entered the uncle's repair shop? No. He did not want to connect the coincidental encounter between the young man and the escaped criminal with these words. Don't think about it. Don't think about it anymore. Su-lo felt very tired. He just wanted to fall asleep, but he could not because this unbearable change was like countless ants crawling in his body. They silently and contemptuously bit and tore at his fresh flesh, spitting extremely corrosive acid. Once the acid splashed, it sizzled. The painful, sore, itchy, and burning sensation converged into a straight line. The line of fire gathered into a ball in his chest and began to burn fiercely. This ball of fire was really unbearable, and he was extremely angry for no reason. Su-lo finally moved. He stood up from the bed and tightly pursed his thin lips. He lifted the heavy prison bed with one hand and slammed it against the snow-white wall in front of him. It was as if he wanted to smash the extremely small ball of black blood and the already withered corpse of the fly into pieces again. With a loud bang, the bed frame broke into pieces and dust flew everywhere. The stern reprimand of the Special Forces soldier came from outside the door, but he acted as if he didn't hear or feel anything. With a heavy punch, he directly smashed the only small square table in the cell into pieces.
Boom, 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 boom.
Countless violent sounds rang out in the cell, and debris flew everywhere. For the first time in his life, Su-lo vented his emotions, so wantonly. He almost crazily smashed everything in front of him that he could see. In the end, even a terrifying hole appeared in the hard alloy door. At this moment, his peripheral vision fell on the window. Through the tempered glass that was so thick that it distorted his vision, he saw the twinkling stars in the late autumn night sky. He did not know why it touched the eternally strong but fragile nerves in his heart for the first time today. Looking at the bright starry sky above his head, he calmed down and slowly walked to the window. There was a crushed pack of cigarettes and a lighter on the ground. They were probably left behind by Madman Lee before she left. Su Lu picked one up, lit it, and stuffed it into his mouth. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the night sky outside the window. He said softly, "Fuck your mother." Chapter 813. Ever since the 37 constitutions, there had always been an ugly person from the Imperium in the hearts of every citizen of the Federation. In their eyes, the cruel enemies of Zhuotianqing were uncivilized, bloodthirsty barbarians, inferior races struggling in the closed and outdated social system. Just like Xiong Linquan's true emotions when he roared furiously on Mo Hua planet, in his eyes, it was impossible for the motherfucking Empire citizens to have a character worthy of praise. Li Feng, who had been fighting the Empire soldiers in the West Woods since he was 12 years old, instinctively believed that there were no good people in the Empire. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the starry sky outside the window. Thinking of his bizarre background, he couldn't help but laugh self-deprecatingly. In the past few years, he had fought for the Federation and the Empire, but it turned out that the people he had killed were all his own people. It turned out that he was actually an inferior race in the eyes of the Federation citizens. Cloaked in glory and guarded his own rights, he had been silently and stubbornly walking the path he thought was right. However, before the white clouds in the sky could turn into dogs and the mulberry fields on the ground could be swallowed by the ocean, the hero of the Federation suddenly became a prisoner, a poisonous seed buried deep in the Federation by the Empire. This kind of strong contrast was not easily accepted by anyone. Su Lu, who had the thickest nerves in the universe, could only stop himself from going crazy and force himself to calm down with the help of the night sky outside the window. That day on the phone, President Pabre had asked him if he felt that the whole world had let him down. At this moment, he really did feel that way. An abandoned child of the Empire stood alone in the prison cell of the Federation, as if the entire universe was slowly leaving him. A thick and deep feeling of loneliness enveloped his entire body. He stood quietly by the window like this for an entire night until the 2 moons dispersed, the stars fell, and the white willow trees appeared on the horizon. Schiller once famously said, "The coming day will be longer than the last year." The original meaning of this sentence was that the unexperienced future was more beautiful and valuable than everything in the past added together. But to Su Lu at this moment, these words meant that even if he only had 1 day left to live, he could only spend it in anger, pain, struggle, and frustration, and it would definitely be extremely long. The newborn red sun struggled to jump out of the horizon and shone on the window of the prison from the side. Su Lu was awakened by the sudden strong light and subconsciously narrowed his eyes. For some reason, he suddenly remembered that in the few years after he escaped from the East Forest sector, his truly happy and peaceful days were actually in the shabby courtyard in the slums of the Left Heaven Space Zone. Were the people of the Empire really born bad people? In fact, he had never thought about it this way. Aunt Susan and Paul were good people, and the Imperial officer under Glacier 5460 was also a good person. So, what if he was from the Empire? The key is what kind of person you are. The fleeting thought was like a ray of light, instantly flashing in his mind and then disappearing, making Su Li's somewhat muddle-headed mind calm down a lot. After a long period of silence, he picked up a piece of sharp metal shard from the ground. Facing the glass, he grabbed a strand of long hair and slowly and seriously cut it off. Following the cutting of the shard, his black hair slowly fell to the ground beside his feet. The somewhat deformed face on the glass window was still so familiar, but the cut short hairstyle that was almost flat cut was particularly messy, like burning weeds. The prison door slid open silently, and the pale and thin Tai Ziyuan walked in. He kicked the bed leg that was smashed by Su Le. He moved his feet with some difficulty and walked behind Su Le. Looking at the messy scene around him, after a moment of silence, he sat directly on the ground and carefully put down the metal box in his hand. Su Le turned his head to look at Tai Ziyuan and calmly greeted him. "You're here?" "Yes, I'm here." Tai Ziyuan raised his head to look at his messy short hair, frowned, and gave a simple reply. In reality, both of them knew that Tai Ziyuan still came to visit Su Le in prison after confirming that he was a seed of the Empire. They didn't know what kind of psychological struggle he had experienced last night.
Sit.
Tai Ziyuan sat on the ground and greeted him. Then he laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "Since His Highness Prince De Lin of the Empire is your uncle, then you are very likely to be the real crown prince of the Empire. Maybe it really is the bloodline at work. No wonder you never respected me, the fake crown prince, since you met me."
Don't talk nonsense.
Su Le kicked away the trash on the ground and sat down directly. He said, "I've never believed in these disgusting bloodline theories. Even if I'm just a dung picker, there's no reason for me to respect you in the way you want me to respect you." He followed up with another sentence. "Other than being better than me in bed, how can you compare to me?" Today, Tai Ziyuan didn't argue with him. He looked at him with a complicated expression and said, "You are really surprising. I thought I would see a martial arts maniac with bloodshot eyes today, but in the end, the one who appeared in front of me is actually the original you. I don't know whether I should praise your pure nature and thick nerves, or laugh at you for being an ignorant and fearless stinky rock. After only one night, you've accepted the fact that you're a citizen of the Imperium." Tai Ziyuan laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "I spent an entire night and still couldn't understand this matter. You watched the biological comparison, so I trust you. Although the charter computer is just a cold machine, I don't think it will make a mistake. So no matter how you think about it, you can't get rid of your identity as a citizen of the Empire. So other than accepting it, what else can you do? That makes sense." Tai Ziyuan was silent for a moment. He took the metal box and opened it. He lowered his head and said seriously, "I will remember the friendship between you and me. In the future, I will tell my descendants that my best friend is a citizen of the Empire." "I remember that you were supposed to get married this autumn," Su Le asked. Tai Ziyuan smiled and replied, "It was postponed."
Su Le was silent.
Tai Ziyuan pushed the metal box in front of Su Le and said, "Plain porridge with scallion pancakes. After eating, you can go on your way in peace and die in peace." Su Le was very clear-headed and calm. No one in the entire Federation would help him, not even his best friend. This had nothing to do with betrayal, and even less with cowardice. It was only related to the endless racial hatred between the Federation and the Empire that had lasted for hundreds of years. His last friend was sending him on his last journey to meet up with his best friend underground. This wasn't too painful of a matter, so after Su Le took the plain porridge and scallion pancakes, he simply said, "Okay." Like a whale sucking in water, he finished the plain porridge in the box. After eating 3 scallion pancakes, the slightly full Su Le suddenly looked at Tai Ziyuan and said, "These last few days, I don't want to eat in the prison cell. Can you help arrange for them to let me eat in the cafeteria?" Tai Ziyuan vaguely caught some information from his words. He suddenly raised his head and stared into his eyes. Su Le didn't evade. He calmly and stubbornly looked back at him. There was only a strong desire to live and the most complete sincerity toward his friend. Chapter 8:14. 24 hours, 9 chapters, 27,000 words. It had never happened before, and it would probably be very difficult in the future. Behind the madness was a pack of Hongdashan, 6 cans of Red Bull, 4 bottles of mineral water, a bowl of zhajiang noodles, and a box lunch. Old Chow said that every word was laborious. Oh, he meant that every word was filled with blood. I was not so miserable. He was the ocean, and I was a drop of water. I just wanted to say that these 27,000 words were written seriously, and my attitude was guaranteed. In the end, I did not feel tired or bitter. Because of my narcissism, I was abnormally excited and broke my own limits until my eyelids were as heavy as my weight. Although I wrote a lot, I encountered the most tragic plot of The Spy. It was not a climax that could pull votes. Even I was depressed, sad, and depressed when I wrote, let alone you who are reading the story. It's the time to welcome the new year. Many people are playing and drinking. I'm chatting with you on the keyboard. I'm not complaining, because it's not bitter at all. After getting high, writing really becomes the best entertainment. It's still that mushy but sincere sentence. Who asked it to be my hobby to serve you? In 2010, I bought a house, learned to drive, bought a car, practiced driving, got a marriage certificate, held a wedding ceremony, went on a honeymoon, and even went to Inner Mongolia to attend Zhang Xiaohua's wedding ceremony. I always hoped that the vast number of wise readers would pity and understand cats. When I had the time and energy to write, I would never not write. When I could not write, then I really could not write. Those who could understand, long live. Those who could not understand, long live 9,000 years, cough cough. To be honest, I came to an unfamiliar place alone, without any connections or experience, to complete the series of things that shrunk the essence, and pain of life really consumed too much of my energy. At the end of the year, I finally finished everything and began to find the world and feeling back. In December, I encountered another week of illness and decadence. But my heart was here, and I did not care. I only needed to work hard and write seriously. In the end, 8 consecutive days of 3 chapters and 1 day of 4 chapters was the most enjoyable and longest process I had ever done since I started writing in 2003. As for today's 9 chapters, it was something that I had never even thought about. It was very refreshing to wash away the busy and gloomy air of this year. It was very refreshing to really challenge my own limits. It was very refreshing to use this method to welcome the new year with you. We were halfway through our journey, and we fought our way from 8th place to 2nd place. Although we were currently in 3rd place, the scene of our chrysanthemum being destroyed was a rare sight for me. Today, other than being crazy, what I was most proud of was that I suddenly realized that I had learned how to use hooks instinctively when writing books. There will always be a place where I can use the pen for clarity in the future. I am very happy about this. When I write slowly, the quality is not necessarily good. When I edit 3 chapters a day, the quality is the best. Today, I wrote so much and my head is so muddled, so the quality is naturally not as stable as when I was writing 3 chapters.
Please bear with me. I'm going to sleep now.
I can't take it anymore. I'm going to welcome the new year in my dreams. As for the final ranking of the monthly votes, it's all up to you. I've already done my best. As for what would happen next year, he would explain in detail tomorrow. The line was still 180,000. I'm really starting to feel sorry for the money you've spent. Of course, I'm not talking about subscriptions. Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year, including the 72 people who sent text messages cursing my computer to crash. In the end, there was a beginning and an end. From 2010 until the very last moment, he shouted, monthly votes. Chapter 815. There was a phrase in the former dynasty that was used to describe people who were full of unyielding spirit and were willing to cross the boundaries of the camp or even the entire world for their friends. That phrase was, the machete man who dared to pay homage to a traitor. This was a very ordinary description, but if you carefully tasted it, you would definitely be able to figure out a strong and silent sense of masculinity. There were many people who dared to be a traitor, but very few people dared to pay homage to a traitor when the overall situation was already decided. This often meant that one needed to stand on the opposite side of morality. Morality was the collective will of social creatures, and it seemed to be so strong and invincible since ancient times, because to defeat it was to defeat one's own heart. Su Lo was a traitor, but his current identity was even more unacceptable to the Federation than a traitor. He was not dead yet, but he was going to die soon. Taizuan came to see him for the last time in prison, which could also be regarded as paying homage to him. The crown prince of the former dynasty had prepared a pot of plain porridge in advance to be the machete man who paid homage to himself. To have such a friend in one's life, Sula felt that this drama of life was already worth the price of admission. As the saying goes, a handshake in the midst of thousands of people will make my sleeves fragrant for 10 years. A bowl of porridge will be cold to the world. How warm will my chest and abdomen be? Before Tai Zuan left, he said that he would try, perhaps just to comfort himself. Before the cold death came, there was still some warm hope, but Sula did not care too much. Whether it was comfort or not, it was obvious that the Crown Prince was trying to make Su Li's last days more comfortable. At the beginning of the morning, the military prison efficiently cleaned up the cell that he had smashed into a garbage dump. They arranged a new bed and a small table, and even hung a soft light screen. Sula did not watch TV, but he could guess what the recent news of the Federation was. Watching scandals and shocking revelations was a very good way to pass the time, but if he was the focus of attention in the news, and the evil camp at that, then this method would become uncomfortable. He rubbed his slightly swollen eyebrows and lay down on the bed, pulling the snow-white blanket over his head. From before the catastrophe to after the catastrophe, from the Federation to the Empire, from the naughty children to the elderly who were about to die, the warm and dark bed had always been the last safe territory that human beings trusted the most. After people were injured or heartbroken, they would crawl into their own bed and block the light from the outside world. This last territory could be easily unified. People could greet His Majesty's pregnant mother under the quilt without worrying about the sharp ears of the intelligence officers. They could do many things that were not allowed by law, and they did not have to worry about the light of the charter breaking through the privacy regulations. In the darkness, Su Li's fingers quietly stretched to the side of the wall. Last night, the crazy smashing to vent his frustration had caused many cracks to appear on the seemingly solid prison walls. He remembered very clearly that there was a standard distribution box in one of the cracks in the cement. His fingers touched a slightly hard feeling. He closed his eyes and pressed hard with his fingertips. The hard material of the distribution box slowly and silently cracked under the magical power spurting out from his fingertips, revealing the complicated wiring troughs inside. As an excellent mechanic, Sula did not even need to look at it. He only needed to stop his finger for a moment to accurately distinguish whether it was a data cable or an energy cable. He also knew what material the cable was made of. There was no way he would get it wrong. His fingertips moved slightly, and the not-so-sharp fingertips easily cut open the outer layer of the data cable. The hard rubber on the cable slowly and silently cracked open like a fatty who had his stomach cut open, exposing the chromium alloy core wire. The rubber curled up and separated on both sides, really like the hard but extremely thin skin of a fish. In the dark world, he closed his eyes and very precisely controlled the burning power that was generated behind his waist. It slowly passed through his shoulders and upper arms, penetrated his fingertips, and entered the exposed data cable. Using the bioelectricity in the human nerves or the jinqi that was similar to pulse waves to communicate with the machine, and even enter the other's processing structure to control the operation of the machine sounded so ridiculous and lacking in possibility, and there was no reason at all. All the science fiction novels in the Federation had never imagined a story with a similar theme, because the science fiction writers had never come into contact with or even heard of the ability in Su Li's body. Last year, when the Nutshell Engineering Department was conducting experiments in the Westwood Sunset State, Sula had tried many times with the help of Zouyu, but he had not made any effective progress. As for the level of being able to directly control the M52 military mecha with just a few charming fingers like Uncle back then, and making the black mecha feel like dying in the hills, it was even more unattainable. It was the same today, but also not the same. Some things had vaguely changed. The high-speed flow of complex numbers in the data cable entered his mind between his fingers, triggering a strange reaction. It did not form a clear image in his conscious mind, only a very strange and vague feeling. He could not pinpoint the specific reason, but he seemed to be able to see on the other end of the chaos. In addition to the central control, the data cable in the wall was also connected to the electronic safety valves of each cell. After an unknown amount of time, he turned over and lay flat on the bed, in a daze under the blanket. He did not know if the very vague feeling in his mind was an illusion caused by his collapse under the heavy pressure, or if his consciousness had really followed the data cable and felt the feedback of information in the distance. Humans were the first order of machines. Did this mean that the bioelectricity in the human body or that strange power could really become a language that machines could recognize? In the hot spring pool in Philadelphia, Lipifu had once mentioned something about the Yadajinchi to him. When the old man was in his prime, he had volunteered to be a test subject for the Federal Academy of Science. Even so, the Academy of Science did not have a precise result, and there was no way to spread it to the entire Federation. However, the Academy of Science had basically confirmed that this kind of training method should be to extract some kind of residual power from the human body that had been passed down since ancient times until it was activated into a specific kind of power. After thinking for a moment, Sulu still could not figure it out, so he thought about it again. He silently held the data cable again and continuously poured the burning power generated by the back of his waist into it. The more he walked, the more he did not cherish it. If the data cable was a highway bridge used by the prison to control each cell and facility, then what he was doing now was using this highway bridge to test the reaction of the prison. At this time, Sulu was not clear about his control of the power in his body. He had obtained a rare opportunity to improve. It was like the transition of electrons in a crystal, or there was no qualitative difference in the rotation pattern, but once it was activated, the time required for the release process could be sharply reduced. Being calm in the face of a major event was a realm that very few people could reach. The pressure and crisis of a tense time could often cause creatures to instinctively break through their own limits. There were great terrors between life and death, but there were also great opportunities. In the past, when Sulu encountered major events or even life and death, he could be calm as usual because he believed that as long as he lived a great life, even if he died a glorious death, there would be no regrets. The so-called terrors were just normal. However, the difference between today and the past was too big. The death he was about to face had nothing to do with glory, and the life he had once lived had nothing to do with greatness. It was just a sad joke. So he had a strong desire to live. However, since it was already confirmed that he was a person of the Empire, he would definitely be immediately sentenced to death. The Federation did not have any mercy, tolerance, or sympathy for the people of the Empire. There was not much time left. Covered and hidden in the darkness of his own territory, Sulu lay there for several hours. Then, he heard the alloy door of the prison cell slowly slide open. The Major General Warden's cold voice rang out. Fortunately, he was not immediately executed. Instead, he announced a temporary change in the prison's measures. He was allowed to go to the cafeteria to eat his last few meals. Shock, shock, and still shock. Within half an hour of the news report from the Federation News Channel appearing on the screens of millions of households, the millions of citizens of the Federation only had this one emotion from the brain to the body. Their thinking ability was shocked to the point of numbness. Their bodies were shocked to the point of being somewhat stiff. In the school cafeteria with lunch boxes in hand, on the sofa with teacups in hand, and in the bar with hard liquor, people opened their mouths and eyes wide, not daring to believe what they heard and saw. The hero of the Federation, Colonel Sulu, was actually the most well-hidden spy of the Empire? Just as Lady Tai had analyzed in Macho's back mountain, although it was still difficult for the citizens of the Federation to accept the truth with Senator Macklin as the scapegoat, the majority of the people believed in this fact in an extremely short amount of time. After all, the results of the two biological marker comparisons were right in front of everyone's eyes. Many people deeply trusted by the people, including Chief Editor Bob, supervised the whole process, and the glory of the charter would never be wrong. The emotional reaction of the Federation citizens was somewhat strange. After the shock, they felt fear, the fear of the decades-long conspiracy of the people of the Empire. When they knew that the beast of the Empire was lurking around them like ordinary people, this fear was hard to suppress. Then, the fear directly turned into disappointment, anger, and extreme embarrassment. Naturally, people projected these emotions onto the spies of the Empire. Macklin was dead, and all the spies of the Empire had been wiped out. Then, the only person left to bear these negative emotions was Su Le. Even the people who had heard some rumors about the Golden Foundation building back then would not think about it now. Macklin was killed by Su Le. They used to enjoy this rumor to add to the legendary glory of their heroes and idols, but now they subconsciously forgot about it. The relationship between heroes, or idols, and the fanatical citizens was actually very similar to the relationship between the romantic men and the resentful women in the romantic novels. Once they realized that the person they loved had lied to them, and the idol turned out to be made of cheap mud, then the deeper the love back then, the deeper the hatred now. The greater the hope back then, the greater the disappointment now, and the more ashamed they felt. Countless young male students went to the food stalls outside the school resentfully and drank until they were drunk. Then, they angrily smashed all the wine glasses and cursed the shamelessness and despicable of Su Le from the Empire. Thinking of how they stupidly put on black masks a few months ago and marched on the street with their classmates to denounce the Federation government for Su Le, they felt extremely ashamed and cursed even louder. Countless young women sulked at home for no reason, criticized their mother's food, and sarcastically mocked the poor taste of the female military stars on TV. When they gathered with their friends, they raised their orchid fingers and mocked that they had long known that Colonel Su Le was not a good person. His small eyes looked so shifty that they had completely forgotten that the word they used to describe his small eyes was charming. They also forgot that the encrypted electronic diary in the drawer had written down their teenage fantasies and the name of a certain hero. When the hero landed on the ground, other than turning the blurry face into a clear and ugly one, it only stirred up a cloud of dust. Other than that, it did not cause any other movement. After the shocking appraisal in the Bureau of Proclamation building, the Federation government directly released Zhou Yu and Shang Qiu. As for what kind of deep-seated reasons were hidden behind the scenes, or what kind of attitude Mr. President wanted to express to the various forces through this release, it would definitely cause many people to speculate and analyze, but the people involved were not interested in it at all. Shang Qiu directly returned to the Harbor City Industrial Park from the capital. She refused the proposal of the CEO of Nutshell to take a vacation, and ignored the rumors in the engineering department that she might be deprived of her independent technical director by the board of directors. She directly threw herself into the heavy work. Her subordinates and the staff of the engineering department all knew the reason for her recent disappearance. No one would talk about the news related to Su Le in front of her. They could only watch her work day and night, and obviously lose weight. One day, the director of Nutshell's engineering department, Mr. Jose, finally could not stand it anymore and comforted her. Sometimes it's a good idea to lose yourself in work, but you have to take care of your health. I just can't find anything else to do except work. This has nothing to do with losing myself in work, because I don't intend to forget anything. Su Le is from the Empire. You have to learn to forget. Shang Qiu inserted the pen lead into her black hair, took off her glasses, and calmly said to Mr. Jose, "I'm an engineer. Whether it's a mecha or a washing machine, in my eyes, it's a combination of a pile of metal components and microchips. Similarly, whether it's from the Empire or the Federation, in my eyes, it's a combination of a pile of muscles, bones, skin, hair, and body fluids. There's no difference in the manner." 10 slightly trembling fingers ran through her black hair. Nan Xiangmei withdrew her gaze from the TV screen, and her beautiful face was filled with sadness. He's from the Empire? How can he be from the Empire? As the current matriarch of the Nan family, Chao Jiren, of course, knew the shocking news much earlier than the ordinary people. She knew that her daughter, who had long been deeply in love with Su Le, would definitely fall into the most difficult period of her life after knowing the truth. She had been sitting on the sofa with her daughter. At this time, looking at her daughter's sad and helpless expression, Chao Jiren sighed faintly in her heart. When it came to love, one would often have to go through all kinds of hardships. For example, she and that wretched fatty had ended their relationship because of the invisible pressure from her family. She believed that her daughter was more determined and braver than herself back then. Whether it was the pressure of family or society, whether it was the division of wealth or power, nothing would shake her daughter's seemingly weak, but actually strong will. Even if Su Lo was a hooligan on the streets, as long as her daughter liked him, she would definitely persevere until the end. However, what stood in the way of this relationship was not Jian Shuer, Zhou Yu, or even Su Lo, who was about to die, but something that no one in this universe could resist. In the bedroom on the second floor, Zhong Huiyan, who had just finished washing her hair, sat on the princess bed with her arms crossed. Her slightly wet black hair had long passed her shoulders and hung down on her white nightgown. She stared at the TV screen with her eyes and mouth wide open. After a while, she suddenly frowned cutely and softly muttered a few very indecent vulgarities. She jumped off the bed, picked up the electronic screen, and began to seriously and silently sketch something. The non-flickering blue lines on the electronic screen gradually became denser and clearer. In the end, a map of Nan Xiangmei's manor was presented. Although the electronic map was not completely drawn, it was very precise. Probably no one would have thought that the 12-year-old little princess of the Zhong family could draw such a precise electronic map based on the impressions left by Nan Xiangmei when she took her to the manor for a horse ride. It even marked several loopholes in the manor's surveillance system. The sound of the door opening was heard. Zhong Huiyan hid the electronic map behind the bed as fast as she could. Her small hands quickly rubbed her face, changing the tense and serious expression that was completely incompatible with her age into a little girl's sweet and innocent smile. Nan Xiangmei walked in and directly sat on the soft couch by the window. She stared blankly at the stars above the treetops outside the window. After a long silence, she said softly, "Do you know about that matter?"
Yes.
Zhong Huiyan made a sound from the depths of her cute nose. Nan Xiangmei slowly lowered her head and hugged her knees, as if she was afraid of cold. She said sadly, "I feel very useless. I can't do anything to help him. And when I found out that he was from the Empire, my first reaction was to forget all the days of the past few years. I don't want to think about him anymore. I don't want to think about whether he can survive. As long as I don't think about him, I can pretend that I have never liked an Empire person that much." Sparkling and translucent tears fell from her eyes. Nan Xiangmei said guiltily and sorrowfully, "The first reaction is the truest reaction. That is to say, I don't love him as much as I thought. I'm very ashamed." "Oh, don't think too much." Zhong Huiyan walked over and comforted her. For the people of the capital ring, the Empire people and the Federation people are not the same race at all. They are a group of beasts. Therefore, if you fall in love with an Empire person, it is equivalent to having sex. Nan Xiangmei did not understand. She raised her head and looked at the little girl's face blankly. Sex is strictly forbidden even on the 18 forbidden forums. It is the most disgusting thing to do, just like those weird uncles who like girls like me. Zhong Huiyan patted her chest with a smile and said, "Of course, a natural good girl like you can't stand such a fierce thing." What a disgusting description. Nan Xiangmei recalled the scene in her mind. There was no blush on her face, only uncontrollable fear. She looked at Zhong Huiyan with a natural and relaxed expression and said with a trace of confusion and unwillingness, "You just said the capital ring. Don't you people of the Westwoods look at the Empire people like that?" "Of course not." Zhong Huiyan waved her thin white arms and said, "We often see Empire people there. There are many prisoners of war, and so on. Although I know that those Empire people are bad, but..." She shrugged and her black hair fluttered slightly. "In our eyes, they are actually as bad as the people of the capital ring." It was a very simple sentence, but it made Nan Xiangmei frown very much. She vaguely grasped some key issues. Zhong Huiyan noticed the change in Nan Xiangmei's mood. She coughed twice to interrupt Nan Xiangmei's thoughts and said with great sincerity and concern, "You don't have to feel guilty. Think about how many of our compatriots have the Empire people killed? How many sisters have they raped? How can you fall in love with an Empire person? Sister Nan Xiangmei, forget these things. Su Lo is not the only man in the world." In the dead of night, Nan Xiangmei, who had experienced a strong mental shock, finally fell asleep. There was still a trace of tears in the corner of her eyes. Zhong Huiyan, on the other hand, opened her bright eyes and looked at the ceiling in a daze. Her heart was full of uncontrollable joy. "You are actually from the Empire? That's good. Those women in the Federation who are infatuated with you will probably all run away. I will be the only one who dares to follow you. You are not the only man in the world, but I am the only girl by your side. Then, other than waiting for me to grow up and become a woman, what else can you do?" The cute little girl tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. A satisfied and nervous smile appeared on her face from time to time. She was not worried about the safety of that person at all. "Die? How is that possible? You are my omnipotent brother Sula, inside the villa in the West Mountain compound." After finally successfully calming down her mother's overly frightened heart, she kicked Zhou onto the bed. Zhou untied her hair and sat in front of the dressing table tiredly. She looked at her haggard face in the mirror. After a long period of silence, that familiar, piercingly cold beauty once again returned to her eyes. She opened the drawer of the dressing table and looked at the little device that Shi Qinghai stuffed into her hand at the charter square. She silently thought, if this thing can really avoid the glory of the charter, then the people who need it the most now are undoubtedly the people of the Empire. The problem is, you are a stupid and ignorant Empire person. Now that you are locked in that damn prison, what damn method can I think of to give you? This was the Qingqing military prison. During the previous dynasty, it was responsible for locking up dissidents. After the Republic, several heads of the 7 families were locked up here. Among the few presidents who were the toughest to deal with the 7 families, except for 2 who were assassinated, one of them was impeached during his term of office. He was serving time for a corruption case, and the location of his sentence was also here. After the most intense and bloody period of the struggle, the 7 families gradually withdrew from the stage and hid behind the scenes. They reached a compromise with the government, and the situation returned to harmony. Since then, this prison was mainly responsible for locking up the most vicious criminals of the Federation. Those who were locked up in the Qingqing military prison rarely had a chance to escape. If someone was really lucky or strong enough to escape, then he would definitely do everything he could for the rest of his life. He would rather die than return to this despairing building complex again. Sula had been here before, and then he was pardoned. Now he was thrown into the Qingqing military prison for the second time. In history, there were no more than 3 people who had encountered the same fate as him. As for escaping, ever since the Qingqing military prison was put into use, such a thing had never happened. No matter how omnipotent a person was in human society, once they entered this place, they would be like a vulture that had lost its wings, or a warship that had lost its crystal mine. No matter how hard they struggled, they would never be able to escape this trap. They would gradually be turned into rotten meat or a cold and senseless pile of steel. The heavy magnetic shackles tore at the muscles of his calves, and the pain was like being cut by knives. The sensor lights around his ankles flashed intermittently, warning the surroundings of danger. There was a sensor-controlled bomb in the shackles, and 3 thick alloy handcuffs that looked like metal rings hung on his wrists. The muscle relaxant that the prison doctor had injected into his body began to take effect. The feeling of weakness spread throughout his body, and it became very difficult for him to drag the heavy shackles on his feet. The heavy alloy bracelet on his wrist pulled his weak forearm downwards. It was like an overripe fruit in autumn, and the weight was so heavy that it caused the branches to bend weakly. Sula narrowed his eyes and raised his head with difficulty to look at the lead-like thick clouds above the transparent dome of the prison. He wanted to make history, to be the first person to successfully escape from the Qingqing military prison, but he had no confidence. He had not even found a clear way to escape. The strong and violent pulling force passed along the noose to his neck, causing him to stagger forward and almost fall. The Major General, the warden, coughed twice and waved his hand to signal his subordinates who were holding the noose to relax a little. He said in a low voice, "It's already very difficult to get you to come out and eat. You'd better not think too much." Sula nodded after a moment of silence. He walked along the magnetic passage to his own table. The crisp sound of metal colliding rang out. On the other side of the transparent wall, The felons who were eating silently looked at the man who was slowly walking past them. They saw his cut short hair pointing to the sky like wild grass, and his beard stubbornly growing roots like a field that had been burned. They all subconsciously put down the cutlery in their hands. For these unforgivable felons of the Federation, this scene was like déjà vu. To be more precise, it was just a boring repetition of the scene from 5 years ago. However, the interval between this repetition was too long. It was more interesting than their daily repetition. It was so long that some of them took some time to remember who he was. "Colonel Sulo, welcome back." One of the felons stood up and shouted at the guy who was struggling to walk on the other side of the transparent wall. Then, 2 electric arcs hit his body. The military guards walked forward with heavy faces, pulled out the batons at their waists, and began to beat him heavily, without mercy. Hearing the sound of hard objects hitting people, Sulu turned around and looked. Looking at the felon who was twitching in pain on the ground with blood flowing out of the corner of his mouth, he remembered that when he was transferred to Qingqing military prison 5 years ago, it was this person who first smiled at him. In the end, because of this smile, he was locked up in the dark prison for 3 days. He didn't expect that this guy would still be so tough 5 years later. It was probably because the prisoners in this prison, other than challenging the authority of the prison, couldn't find anything else to do to pass the long life that made people want to die but couldn't bear to throw it away. Sulu smiled and waved at the felons of the Federation on the other side of the transparent wall. The speed of his arm waving was very slow, but in the eyes of the Major General behind him, it was as if he saw the slow-moving arm trying to throw something into the ashes to ignite the flame that seemed cold but hid fierce energy. The food in the prison was not bad. Although it was not as good as the food in the front line, the nutrition was guaranteed. The main dish was potatoes with egg white meat, vegetables, salted cucumbers, and an orange. It only took Sulu a short time to finish the food in front of him with the numbered utensils in his hands. But today, he ate very slowly and chewed very carefully, as if he was chewing all the energy contained in each grain of rice and each piece of potato into nutrients that he could absorb and then store them in his body. He ate slowly and thought casually, accepting the fact that he was a citizen of the Empire, forgetting the feeling of identity tearing brought by the education in the Federation, and not having the painful struggle of literature and art forever was a very simple thing to do. However, when the incident happened to a specific individual, it would become more complicated. For example, he had to face the fact that in terms of blood relationship, Macklin and County King Carlton were both his close relatives and even his close uncles, but they were both killed by him. Would this situation be brought to the court of morality? Sulu put the last piece of potato into his mouth and chewed carefully and even delicately. As his chewing muscles stretched, a mocking smile appeared on his face. No one could judge himself in the court of morality. The problem now had nothing to do with morality. It was only about life and death, and he did not want to die. It was as simple as that. Pushing the plate further away, he took the orange and began to peel it. The white strands under the orange peel were a bit dry. He licked his dry lips and narrowed his eyes. His peripheral vision passed through the transparent wall and fell on the felons of the Federation on the other side. The old man by the window who was trying to find a few tiny eggs on the orange peel was called Mend. He was a former professor of the 3 departments of the Federation Military Science Academy and the best biochemist in the Federation. If it were not for the fact that he used his latest research to break the law and killed his wife's family for no reason, in many people's eyes, he would have won more than 3 Nebula Awards in his life. The bald man who was grinning and looking at him was called George. He looked very simple and honest, but in fact, he was a rare expert in the Federation forces. His hands were stained with the blood of countless enemies and comrades. He was incomparably cruel. This man insisted on calling himself St. George because he believed in a certain primitive religion in the Bermuda Triangle Star region. It was also because of that damned religion that he tore 7 innocent recruits into pieces in the recruit camp. In the court of martial, he insisted that he felt the guidance of the Lord. The man who was smiling innocently, like a child, was called Charles. He was the most notorious serial killer of prostitutes in the Federation. The first prostitute to die in his hands was his own mother. There was also that handsome middle-aged man who looked like a stone sculpture. What was his name? Sula frowned and carefully recalled. Oh, yes, his name was Tong Jiajin. He was a person that even he himself was afraid of. Sula suddenly felt that this scene was very strange. As he shifted his gaze, the identities and backgrounds of these men clearly appeared in his mind. It was somewhat similar to the scene when he led Group 7 to the front lines. The only difference was that Xiong Linquan and the others were truly fearless warriors, while these people were truly fearless criminals. Back when he was transferred to the military prison in Allure, he ate with these criminals through the wall. In the shortest time possible, with the help of the old man, he figured out the identities and abilities of these criminals. It was because he wanted to use these people's abilities to escape from prison. However, he was later pardoned by President Pabre. Naturally, these preparations were useless. Who would have thought that they would come in handy again 5 years later? The prison was still the same prison, and the criminals on the other side of the transparent wall were still the same criminals. Other than men's hair that had turned from white to silver, and St. George's bald head that had more scars and wrinkles, the 5 years did not seem to have left any trace. Then he noticed that an old voice was missing from the other side of the transparent wall. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the orange in his hand in silence. The owner of the old voice used to be the spiritual leader of the prisoners in this military prison. His identity was very mysterious. Even the old man couldn't find a more accurate file except for a citizen number. If someone could sort out the story of this person, it would be a real legend. But now, he had disappeared in this prison without a trace. It seemed that no one could truly defeat time. War god Li Pifu could not, and neither could the unknown old man in the prison. Then could anyone defeat this prison? His fingers sank into the soft peel of the orange. Sula frowned and thought for a long time in silence. Suddenly, he put the orange back on the plate and struggled to stand up with the help of the table. He looked at the other side of the transparent wall. As if sensing his gaze, the notorious or guilty prisoners on the other side of the transparent wall collectively raised their heads and looked back at him. Their eyes were either complicated or amused. The guards in the military prison, especially the special forces responsible for guarding Su Lo, suddenly became nervous. Orders rang out in the communication system. More than a dozen guards walked towards Su Lo, trying to stop him from doing what he was going to do. Su Lo did nothing. He just looked at the prisoners on the other side of the transparent wall, raised the shackles in his hands high, and said, "Live a lowly life, or die a happy death." There was a deathly stillness in the prison. The cold autumn sun suddenly penetrated the thick dark clouds, passed through the transparent dome, and shone on his body. A prisoner on the other side of the wall shouted, "Not enough reason." The baton and electric current attacked his body. Before he fell, he shouted to the criminals on the other side of the transparent wall, "Because I want to live." Chapter 816. The entire world was shocked. Then, before the psychological impact caused by this matter, not a single federal citizen would be in a good mood. Only the federal government would be able to shake off the previous stormy environment in an instant and come to the blazing warmth of the sun. The official residents that held the initiative did not use this opportunity to launch an attack on the hostile forces of the capital ring. Instead, by releasing Shang Qiu and Zhou Yu, he vaguely expressed his attitude to all parties. During the war with the Empire, the Federation could allow internal disputes and even internal strife, but it was not allowed to cause a full-scale conflict. This was the great reconciliation technique that Mr. President was best at. He was used to doing it beautifully, using his own concessions to exchange for more concessions from the other party. In fact, the 7 families and the Federation government did not want a full-scale conflict. Since the bloody period of history, the Federation had been peaceful for too long. If a war suddenly broke out, whether it was the Federation government that had scruples or the families that had been at peace for a long time, it would be very difficult for them to fully mobilize their resources and mentally prepare in this short period of time. Today, in the picturesque manor behind Macho Mountain, on the terrace where one could see the lake and mountains, an important conversation was taking place. Probably because people were on the terrace and did not need to open the door to see the mountains. This conversation was particularly direct. In just a few words, countless winds and clouds gathered. If I remember correctly, this should be the first time Mr. President has entered Macho Mountain. Lady Tai gently stroked the smooth handle of the coffee cup with her fingers and smiled at the middle-aged man across the table. President Pobre's expression was calm. He raised his right arm and casually waved as he replied, "It is very convenient to come, but what identity do I have to come with? I have not figured out this identity before, so it is not convenient for me to visit Madam." Lady Tai's smile gradually disappeared. She clearly understood what the other party wanted to express. 5 years ago, in the Federation election, Macho Mountain chose to support Pobre, who was still a member of parliament at the time, and even accepted Pobre's harsh conditions because Macho Mountain thought highly of him. However, in the 5 years after he became president, Mr. Pobre had not taken a single step into Macho Mountain. Identity was indeed very important. Was he the president of the Federation or the president of the back mountain? Pobre was unwilling to visit this picturesque landscape as someone who was supported, even if he was a collaborator. Until today, when the government he led finally had enough strength, or perhaps qualifications, to accept the invitation as the president of the Federation. I can understand the ambition of a politician, even your dream of being re-elected 3 times. Lady Tai said in a slightly mocking tone, "But I really didn't expect your ambition to be so far beyond that. You even want to overturn all of us old guys." President Pobre's voice was deep, and his eyes were clear and threatening. "Madam, I know what you're thinking. 5 years ago, you surprisingly chose to work with me. Was it just because I had the support of the 3 major unions and some worthless resume? No, it was because Madam had long seen what kind of person I was. You knew that once I became the president of the Federation, I would definitely have some intentions. I would want to leave behind something different in history. I don't deny that after the end of the next term, I want to change the election law and the Constitution and try to become the first president in the history of the Federation to be re-elected 3 times. However, during these 5 years, you seem to have always expressed tacit approval and support for this plan of mine."
Why?
President Pobre calmly looked at Madam and continued, "Because you need a powerful partner to be the first to break the hard and cold provisions of the Constitution. As long as you get used to breaking them, then the follow-up will become very simple." A faint mocking smile hung on his thick lips. "After I'm re-elected 3 times, the Crown Prince should have just finished his 2 terms as a state legislator and a member of the Federation Management Committee. You definitely want him to become the youngest president in history. Then, since I, the former president, can be re-elected, why can't President Tai be re-elected? When the time comes, how many times do you want him to be re-elected? 2, 3, or 4 times? Or should I say, let him continue until the glory of the Tai dynasty is restored?" President Pobre's eyes were serious and burning as he stared at Lady Tai's face. He was full of pressure. "Madam, when it comes to ambition, you are the woman with the greatest ambition in the universe. After being unceremoniously exposed by Mr. President, the ultimate goal of her silent operation for the rest of her life." Lady Tai's eyes turned cold for an instant. She immediately returned to normal and picked up the teacup to take a few sips. "Ambition must be matched with equal power. You dare to try to rewind history and return to the era of the reactionary dynasty. Maybe you really think that you are the woman with the most power in the universe." President Pobre looked at the exposed late autumn lake forest. A trace of indifference flashed across his dark face. "But please don't forget that I am the president of the Federation. Mr. President, I think that in the past 5 years, whether it is me or those old guys, we have invested enough goodwill and support in you, the elected president." Lady Tai looked at his side profile quietly. After a moment of silence, she said, "It has always been you trying to obtain more things. Those things have even exceeded the limits that a rational person should have." "What limits? Who set these limits? Why does the Federation government have to abide by formless limits?" Or do you still think that your words can be as powerful as the Magna Carta or the Supreme Court's rulings? President Pabre looked at her mockingly. His tough tone softened a bit. He said, "Madam, you are wrong about one thing at the beginning. My government and I have never thought of overturning you. We just hope that the way this society operates can become more reasonable." The mining preparations for the mining of the Galaxy X have already begun. If there are no problems with the plan, we can start harvesting in about 2 years. These mining planets of the Empire are resources that the Federation forces have exchanged with their lives and blood. But your Crystal Mining Consortium wants to seize the benefits of all the people of the Federation without spending a single cent. This is an extremely unreasonable method. At this point in the conversation, Lady Ty's calm eyes finally began to blossom with a sharp light. She looked at the president coldly and said extremely slowly, "The Crystal Mining Consortium naturally owns all the crystal mining resources in the entire universe. We cooperate in all aspects according to the needs of the government. This is the iron law that the Ty family and the government reached at the beginning of the Republic when we were willing to peacefully give up the throne and all the power. This iron law was even written into the secret Magna Carta. It has been enforced for thousands of years. No government has dared to violate it. Mr. President, your request is a bit too much." Iron law? Or perhaps it is more appropriate for us to call it a shameful deal, President Pabre refuted in a deep voice. "Regardless of whether it is a deal or an iron law, this is history." Lady Ty looked at him with a serious expression and said very seriously, "Mr. President, I am very clear that it is very difficult for a person with such a strong heart like yours to develop feelings of reverence. But for history, it is best for you to show more reverence." "Madam, can I understand this as some kind of threat?" President Pabre was silent for a very long time. His thick black eyebrows slowly rose up. "You have to understand one thing. This is no longer the era of the Empire. With the release of information, it is very difficult for the 7 great families to forever hide behind the scenes of history. Once the people know the truth behind these deals, what kind of extreme reaction will they have? Is this considered a threat that you and the government are issuing to me, Mr. President?" Lady Ty calmly replied. The president shook his head and said in a soothing tone, "Madam, I am not a radical, violent person like those in Green Dragon Mountain. I also don't want the Federation to fall into turmoil. These things that I am doing, in my opinion, are only some extremely mild requests and measures." Without waiting for Lady Ty to reply, he resolutely raised his right hand and said, "I agree that the 7 great families still have enough privileges. This is already a concession. Then, Madam, you and your companions must also express enough sincerity. I will consider your proposal." Lady Ty's expression was indifferent. She raised the cold tea in her hand. President Pabre stood up. Accompanied by his aides, he walked towards the outside of the terrace. Suddenly, he stopped and turned around to add in a deep voice, "I would like to remind the House of Lee to stop trying to obstruct the passage of the additional clause of the Golden Fusion algorithm on Parliament Hill. The days of financial oligarchs using mathematical tools that no one can understand and plundering the wealth of the entire Federation are over. If the House of Li Yuan insists on fighting, I don't mind forcibly dissolving the parliament and changing the election ahead of time." After President Pabre and his aides, as well as the agents of the Special Task Force hiding in the dark left, the terrace of Mo Chao's manor in the back of the mountain returned to silence. Lady Tai put down the teacup in her hand and quietly walked to the railing. She leaned on the cold white stone railing and looked at the cold scenery of the lake and mountains in silence for a long time. Butler Jean put a pot of hot tea on the table and looked at the back of his wife worriedly. He didn't know what to say to comfort her at the moment. The 7 great families that had accompanied the Federation for tens of thousands of years had finally met a strong opponent. Although they had fought many powerful Federation governments and amazing presidents in the past, the middle-aged man they were facing this time had already demonstrated his absolute control over the Federation society through many things. The biggest difference between this president and the previous presidents was that under his seemingly gentle appearance, there was a strong enough ambition that he didn't hesitate to use special means. What was even more frightening was that through the war with the Empire, the historically weak army had finally stepped onto the stage of history and stood firmly behind this middle-aged man. The 7 great families, led by Mo Cho, had to face a major change that hadn't happened in thousands of years. 5 years ago, when Mo Cho supported Pobre in the election of the Federation president, she probably didn't expect that she was grooming a gravedigger for herself. Secretary Shin looked at the presidential motorcade, leaving the manor with a complicated expression. He quietly walked to the terrace and reported in a low voice, "There will be a 3rd reading of the relevant bill on Parliament Hill in the afternoon. That's what the Leaf family should be concerned about." Lady Tai didn't turn her head. Her voice was a bit bleak because of the cold autumn wind. "Right now, I only care about how long Su-la can live. According to the news from the official residence, Mr. President will sign the order by tonight at the latest." General Lee Jae-do has been waiting in the official residence with the military court's death warrant. Lady Tai was silent for a moment. She turned around and leaned against the railing. She looked at Shin Lee and calmly said, "Inform our friends in the Supreme Court and ask them to help delay the time. In addition, the people in the official residence should also move. They should try to delay Su Lee's execution as much as possible." Secretary Shin looked at her in surprise. He immediately raised a firm objection. "Madam, Colonel Su-la has been determined to be a seed of the Empire. If we still maintain a relationship with him, it will easily become a loophole for the government to attack. Also, it is impossible to rescue him from the military prison in Qingcheng. Even if he escapes from the military prison in Qingcheng, it will be meaningless to us. A person of the Empire has 0 value in the Federation. I don't expect Su-la to survive, but if he can live for 1 more day, he can delay the attention of the official residents for 1 more day. We need time now." Lady Tai paused for a moment and said, "Although he is a person of the Empire, he is still valuable to us. Even if the Supreme Court interferes, or even take the risk of mobilizing the people in the official residence, I don't have the confidence that we can delay the execution of Su-la by the government." After a moment of silence, Secretary Shin gave an honest answer. Lady Tai looked at him quietly for a long time. Her calm eyes were filled with a faint sense of mockery and oppression. She said, "You were sent to my side by the Trinity Association to carry out the most difficult mission. Since you can still convince Pobre and Lee Jae-do to believe that I don't doubt you and still believe you, why can't they believe you more?" Among the idiotic characteristics of the Federation that were often mocked by the royal family of the Empire, the most famous was its cumbersome bureaucratic procedures. This was especially the case in the Parliament Hill, a building full of a rotten and cold smell. Even if it was just reviewing the budget supplemental bill that was urgently needed at the front line, it still had to go through countless troublesome and unnecessary steps. For example, when the hero of the Federation, Colonel Su-la, was exposed as a spy of the Empire, this was already an ironclad case with irrefutable evidence, but the members of the Parliament Hill still strongly requested that a secret hearing be held. Having just experienced the bitter battle over the additional terms of the financial bill, the members of the Parliament Hill forced themselves to focus their attention again, rubbing their dark circles under their eyes. Right now, there was no one in the Federation who dared to defend Su-la. Several members of the Parliament who took the stage to speak one after another criticized the royal family of the Empire, who was locked in prison with a stern sense of justice. It seemed that if they did not do so, they would not be able to express their love for the Federation and their hatred for the Empire. It was not known from which corner of the internet that the members of the Parliament found the so-called evidence, but they actually brought out countless basins of smelly black water and splashed it on Su-la without mercy. They did not even let go of the so-called rotten private life of that rock. When the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Xiaoqing, responded to the request and reported the process of the pursuit of Su-la to the members of the Parliament, a member of the Parliament below the stage seemed to be very wise and suggested a possibility. "Commander Xiaoqing, in your opinion, when Su-la entered the Empire to hunt down Duke Carlton, could it be possible that it was a scheme of the Empire's royal family? He was able to escape Tianjing planet safely, Could it be that he already knew about his background at that time and began to work for the Empire from then on? Du Shaoqing, who was on the speaker's seat, looked at the pot-bellied parliament member with a cold gaze. After a long silence, he replied, "Idiot." The word idiot reverberated in the grand hall of the Parliament Mountain. That parliament member was so angry that his face turned red, and he almost had a heart attack. More members of the parliament started to discuss animatedly, feeling extremely angry. Du Shaoqing walked directly to the side hall, not even bothering to look at these parliament members. For a soldier like him, who valued discipline, to actually say the word idiot in a sacred place like the Parliament Mountain meant that the level of idiocy of these parliament members was beyond his imagination. They were completely unable to control their emotions. As a soldier of the Federation, I hate all men of the Empire, and that naturally includes Su Lo. He looked indifferently at Li Feng in front of him and said, "When I was about to kill him, you are the one who stopped me. You should have known what this meant at that time." "I understand," Li Feng replied after a moment of silence. Du Shaoqing calmly looked at the young colonel who was more than half a head taller than him and said, "My troops and I are about to head to the front line. You must take responsibility for this matter. If Su Le survives, you owe me a life." Li Feng was silent once more, and then he said those two words again, "I understand. If anyone wants to save him, or if he dares to break out of prison, I will personally kill him." In fact, there were many things that Madman Li still did not understand. For example, how could that fellow who had once eaten and slept with him for many days be an innately evil and cruel citizen of the Empire? For example, why did his aunt show such a fierce attitude towards Su Le despite knowing that he was a citizen of the Empire? After arriving at the Army Command Center from the Parliament Mountain, he stood at the end of the corridor with his hands behind his back. His posture was as straight as a silent wall, blocking all the officers who tried to enter the corridor. This was because in the office behind him, his aunt and his father were having a conversation that they did not want anyone to hear. You should know very well that if there's only one person left in the Federation who doesn't care if Su Le is a citizen of the Empire, then it's definitely me. In the room, Jian Shuier took off the light-colored hood of her sports jacket and calmly spoke to her cousin behind the table. Her beautiful black hair flowed over her shoulders like flowing water, and the brightness in her eyes was like a lake in autumn. However, this lake contained too many complicated emotions, as well as persistence. Li Jiedu, who had just returned from the president's residence, looked at the black hair floating on the other side of the table. For some reason, he naturally thought of how this girl looked like today before she left Philadelphia for the capital and dyed her hair into that strange purple color. Her beautiful face that had been perfect since she was young was always filled with a sweet smile. She would follow his footsteps and hurriedly run along the lakeside, constantly calling out, "Brother Zidao, Brother Zidao, Brother Zidao." More than 10 years had passed, and he was no longer that wooden military instructor who had just gotten married in his middle age. That little girl, who was like his own daughter, had also become the national idol of the entire Federation. More importantly, like all girls who had grown up, their hearts had already left their own home, and some of them were reluctant to throw themselves into the arms of their loved ones. "Just because he's your fiancé?" Li Jiedu slowly withdrew his gaze and looked at the documents on the table. He said softly, "Don't forget, Su Le is my uncle's student, and also my father's favorite junior. I don't have any personal opinions about him, but he's a citizen of the Empire, so all these relationships will no longer exist. The feelings between you and him, or the private engagement, must also no longer exist." "I'm not talking about the engagement." Jian Shui took a step forward. After a moment of silence, she said, "I don't care if he's a citizen of the Empire, because half of my blood is from the Empire." Hearing this, Li Jiedu's fingers that were holding the digital pens suddenly stiffened. He slowly raised his head and looked at his sister's face. He asked coldly, "Where did you hear this nonsense? This is the truth, right?" Jian Shui didn't answer his question. Li Jiedu looked at her expressionlessly. After a long silence, he said, "My father said that your mother should be the daughter of the former master fan of the Empire." In other words, your maternal grandfather is my father's teacher. I don't think this needs special attention. But he's still a citizen of the Empire. Jian Shui said stubbornly. Li Jiedu slammed his palm on the table, breaking the digital pen into 3 pieces. He sternly reprimanded, "Don't forget that your surname is Li. The blood of the Lees of Philadelphia flows in your body. Even my uncle respects his surname. You must protect the survival of this family and not think about other things." The office was deathly silent. After a long time, Jian Shui slowly buttoned up her windbreaker and said softly, "I understand. But can you tell me how you guess that he's a citizen of the Empire?" This question was on the minds of many people. Li Jiedu exposed Su Li's identity as a citizen of the Empire, which directly led to the sudden change of the situation in the Federation. The elders of the big families, who were watching the show with cold eyes, were caught unprepared by this storm. After the incident, they found that this was the most difficult point to understand in the big change of the situation. Even President Pabre and Director Chui Jiadong of the Bureau of Proclamation didn't understand how Li Jiedu could find hope in the void and discover such a sharp move on the chaotic chessboard. However, out of respect and even awe of Li Jiedu, they didn't ask any more questions. After a moment of silence, Li Jiedu said, "Before my father died, he told me that my uncle is still alive. I think you should also know about this." Jian Shui nodded. "What can this prove?" "My uncle didn't stop you from being with Su Lo, which overturned a certain guess of many people, including me," Li Jiedu calmly explained. "Su Lo is not his illegitimate son." "I never thought about this." Jian Shui lightly shrugged. "But I thought about it before, and I believe that the emperor and the princess of the empire must have thought so too." "Is this very important?" "Very important." Li Jiedu gently put down the half of the digital pen in his hand, took a tissue and carefully wiped his fingers. "Because when combined with the power in Su Li's body, it can explain a lot of things. The power called true qi comes from the empire. Even in the empire itself, only the royal family of the empire and the people of the Master Fan family can cultivate it. When the former Master Fan visited the Federation, among hundreds of millions of people, only the 2 of us were found to be able to cultivate this mysterious power. I didn't inherit this ability. Even Li Feng had to use medical and physical methods to activate this power. That's why I find it hard to believe that my uncle would wander to Donglin and casually find a genius young man who is suitable for cultivation in that shabby repair shop. The blood of the Lees of Philadelphia can cultivate true qi. This is already a small probability event, probably 1 in 100 million. My uncle so coincidentally found Su Lo. The probability is also 1 in 100 million. Li Jiedu looked at Jian Shui, and calmly said, "According to the concept of mathematics, a small probability event has a possibility of existing, but when 2 small probability events are added together, the extremely small probability, we can equate it to 0. In other words, it is impossible for it to happen. There may be a repair shop in some corner of the universe, and there may be a genius student in the repair shop. But there must be an internal logical reason why he is such a genius. There are only 2 answers that can explain Su Li's power. Either he has the blood of the Li family in him, or he must be a member of the Empire's royal family." The office was silent again. After a long time, Jian Shui shook her head in confusion. She frowned and asked in disbelief, Could it be that you just based on these conjectures, you are sure that he is from the Empire?" "Conjecture is a good word to use." Li Jiedu replied with a smile. "I was indeed guessing. But in the end, the facts proved that I guessed right. If that is the case, it means that I have indirectly exposed his identity and sent him to his death." Jian Shui's expression was gloomy. She forced a smile and looked at her cousin behind the desk. She whispered, "Brother, although rumors say that my father is extremely cold-blooded and heartless and doesn't care about anything, I really want to know, since he is alive, are you worried about what he will do this time?" After saying this, she covered her face with the hood of her windbreaker and turned to leave. Looking at the closed door, Li Jiedu's mood was extremely complicated. He knew that this was probably the last time his sister would call him brother. He was naturally vigilant about his seemingly omnipotent and terrifying uncle, but his father had already left this world. Who dared to say that they could defeat the unknown strong man of the Lees of Philadelphia? There were still several important links about this whole matter that he had not completely figured out. His uncle should have known that Su Lo was a member of the Empire's royal family, so he chose to stay on the Baron Donglin mineral star. What was his intention? From some of the arrangements, it could be vaguely proved that his father should also have some inside information. But why did he ignore it and even tried to let Sula take over? Was Sula the son of the Empire's Huai Fuchai, or the descendant of the prince who died in the civil strife? After a while, Li Jiedu withdrew his gaze, took out a new digital pen from the drawer, and continued his work. None of this was important anymore, because the young man was about to die. He is my father's only living son, my younger brother. Huai Chaosher sat on the tourist bench beside the charter square of the Federation. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the fake bronze statue in front of her and the new statue further away. As the famous princess of the Empire, she actually had the opportunity to enter the core of the Federation and see the statue of Li Pifu at such a close distance. It was not hard to imagine what kind of complicated and strange emotions would arise in her heart. However, at this moment, all her emotions were focused on the guy who was said to be secretly imprisoned. Great Teacher, who was wearing the famous winter clothes of the Federation, sat beside her and looked at the statue and the fat pigeons in the square. He observed the expressions of the late autumn tourists, and his eyes were filled with excitement. He murmured at a high frequency that his life was worth it and that he was going to find Skillamu. The two, disguised as ordinary members of the Empire's underground resistance organization, did not need to follow Mu En in the hypocritical conversation with the Federation government. The relevant agencies of the Federation government were also very willing to show the glorious history and beautiful scenery of the Federation to these rural barbarians in the left sky star zone. Of course, every member of the underground resistance organization's diplomatic mission was in a real-time status right now. Who knew how many undercover officers of the military intelligence department were hiding around them? Seeing the heavy expression on Huai Caosher's face, Great Teacher Fan Yuguang suddenly pointed at a young Federation couple who was chasing each other among the fallen leaves and said with a smile, "It really can't be seen from the surface, but these human beings have a small chip behind their neck." It seems that the people of the Federation have really gotten used to living with a dog chain, just like how the people of the Empire have gotten used to living under the rule of the royal family. There is no essential difference. The wide characteristic of the hat covered the middle-aged man's handsome face that did not look like a normal person, making his voice a little hoarse. Then he said with some embarrassment, "I'm sorry about that matter. I really did not expect that the relationship between you two would almost lead to a big mistake." Because they were deep in the capital of the Federation, they knew that every corner and even the air was filled with the radiance of the Charter of the Federation. Furthermore, the legendary omnipotent central computer of the Federation could obviously understand the language of the Empire, so the conversation on the bench was exceptionally simple and vague. However, Huai Chaosher understood why this crazy uncle of hers was apologizing. When the battleship left the Old Moon base and was about to arrive at S1, he had already expressed a similar apology. For this crazy Great Teacher fan who dared to kidnap the princess of the Empire in the name of love, peace, and literature, and tried to use aphrodisiac to make her and Su Lo fuse, such a deep and lasting apology was a rare emotion. It could also be imagined how terrifying that incident was. Even the crazy Great Teacher fan felt that it was too fucking crazy. The Imperial family and the Great Teacher fan manor were, without a doubt, the two places in the universe that had the deepest understanding of the Hakone Jinchi, far above the Lees of Philadelphia. Therefore, when Su Lo was captured and brought to Tianjing, everyone from the Emperor to Huai Chaosher and the Great Teacher thought that Su Lo was Nasri's illegitimate son without a second thought. It was only when the news of Su Lur and Jian Shuer's marriage spread that the Imperial family suddenly realized that they had made the biggest mistake of their life. The Great Teacher was embarrassed, ashamed, and afraid that he had tried to make a pair of siblings fall in love with each other to bring peace to the universe. Hui Chaoshi was frustrated that she had brushed past her only biological brother and seemed to have missed him just like that. A black mass of people walked out of the majestic Parliament Hill and walked down the stone steps. The Empire's underground resistance group had ended their visit to the Parliament Hill. Both parties exchanged opinions. Mr. Mu En and the members praised the Federation's hospitality. At the same time, they expressed that they had been deeply influenced by the atmosphere of democracy and freedom today. In the future, they would definitely promote such a complete elected system in the Zhuotian galaxy. Hui Chaoshi and the great teacher stood up from the bench and walked towards the stone steps. Through the crowd, she noticed that Mu En nodded subtly and guessed that the Federation had agreed to that request. Her eyes slowly narrowed as she thought to herself that there was finally a possibility. The fleet drove into the heavily guarded West Mountain compound. Mr. Mu En, who purposely did not wear a leather coat, walked into the independent building with a solemn expression, followed by several of his entourage. This was an unplanned itinerary. The Federation government had refused many times, but Mu En insisted that although Colonel Su Le had been proven to be a member of the imperial family with dirty blood flowing from every pore of his body, they once had an indestructible friendship after all. He hoped that the Federation government would respect the insistence of the Zhuotian galaxy men. In the end, they almost reached a dead end. Mu En suddenly lowered his request, saying that even if he could not visit Su Le in prison, he should at least be allowed to visit Miss Soyu. After all, according to the traditions and customs of the Zhuotian galaxy, expressing condolences to the deceased's widow was a sacred and inviolable right. It must be said that the Federation government, which knew very little about the Empire, did not have any good ideas when faced with Mu En's insistence, traditions, and customs of the Zhuotian galaxy. In the room on the second floor, Zhou frowned as she looked at the three people from the Empire in front of her. She was extremely puzzled. Why did they insist on visiting her, Su Le's widow? That fellow wasn't dead yet. Most importantly, when did she become the lover and the mother of his child that Mr. Mu En spoke of? The one that Su Le couldn't forget during his desperate escape from Tianjing planet? Please take a seat. She politely invited everyone to sit down. In reality, this was the first time she had seen people from the Empire alive, so it was inevitable that her emotions would be somewhat strange. She did not know what kind of drinks she should serve them.
Mr.
Mu En glanced at Hui Chaoshi with a complicated expression. Even he did not understand what the purpose of this trip was. Zhou keenly sensed that the extremely unassuming skinny young man actually had a position far above Mu En's. However, this Mu En was the head of the diplomatic mission. So, who was this skinny young man? And why was that middle-aged man wearing a hat so impolite and flipping through her books without her permission? The great teacher beside the bookshelf turned around, took off his hat, and bowed to Zhou with a smile. Then, he mouthed a silent sentence to Hui Chaoshi. This beautiful lady is actually not inferior to your sister, who is stranded in Philadelphia. It seems that our crown prince really has good luck with women. Hui Chaoshi understood the great teacher's words. Expressionlessly, she reached into her bosom and took out a few pieces of paper. She placed them in front of Zhou in an extremely secretive manner. Zhou, who was stunned speechless by the handsome face of the Empire's middle-aged man, subconsciously looked down. Then, she was shocked by the few lines of Federation words written on the paper. She almost cried out in shock. 3 simple lines of words were written on the 3 pieces of paper. My name is Hui Chaoshi. Su Le is my younger brother. You can tell my identity to the Federation government. If not, then you can help me. Before and after the 40th chapter of Book 4, Starlight Fleeting Time, the great teacher with bare legs with love locked them in a secret room and drugged them with aphrodisiac. Then, Su Le mentioned Schiller's 8-part symphony. Now that I look back at the plot of the secret room, it should be more interesting. At that time, many of my friends were talking about pushing them down. In fact, if I recall the plot of the 8-part symphony, I might think of the relationship between the man and woman in the secret room. So, I definitely can't push it down. Otherwise, there will be a big mess. Chapter 8:17. Zoe moved her eyes away from the paper with great difficulty. She raised her head and looked at the ordinary thin young man who was close by. Her eyes, which were usually cold and proud, were completely occupied by an expression of disbelief. There was no need to repeat the background narration that the people of the Empire and the people of the Federation remembered deeply. It was enough for her to know who Huai Chaosher was. His identity, and the fact that he had shockingly appeared in the Federation was like a whole bucket of ice that was suddenly stuffed into her stomach in the middle of summer. It was not so easy to swallow. Therefore, there was only one word left in her stomach. Her brain instantly had 4 deep crosses. It was difficult for her to think. She was shocked speechless and could not come back to her senses. Most people would need a long time to digest such a shocking situation, but what Huai Chaosher lacked the most right now was time. He had taken the risk to enter the West Mountain compound and admitted his identity to Zoe. There was no way for him to spend more time to persuade her. Therefore, looking at her expression, he frowned slightly in annoyance. However, Zoe was Zoe after all. She was not an ordinary person. She made a decision in a very short time. She walked directly to the dressing table, opened the drawer, and took out a small device that emitted blue light. She handed it to Huai Chaosher and said quietly, "You may need this. Also, do you know the address?" In the late autumn, the first snow fell in the capital. In the dim twilight, the uninvited snowflakes were covered with a layer of light red. Between the sparse buildings, it was as if there were tons of burning paper slowly drifting down. These burning paper drifts fell on the flat and open lawn in front of the official residence, reflecting a faint luster. The snow-white grass mixed with the evening red, casting a large pool of strange colors. It was very much like the bleeding soldiers wearing dark green military uniforms in Glacier 5460. President Pabre silently looked at the falling snow outside the window. He turned around and signed his name at the signature of the death order document on the table. His handwriting was vigorous and powerful, definitely not weak. The staff of the official residence silently took the document and walked out of the Oval Office to hand it to the people who had been waiting outside. Li Jadu looked at the death order document in his subordinate's hand and ordered, "After he dies, bring me the metal bracelet on his wrist." At the end of the wastelands in Huron Province, Qingcheng Military Prison had already experienced 3 consecutive days of snowstorms. The perfect independent energy system allowed the prison to still be enveloped in a warm atmosphere. However, the snowflakes that fluttered down tirelessly outside the window made the prison officers feel an inexplicable chill. During lunch that day, Su Lu raised the shackles in his hands towards those evil and terrifying felons through the transparent wall and said a few seemingly meaningless words. Since then, the prison had never let him out of that specially designed cell. The prison firmly believed that those felons, who had long been numb to despair, would not have any bold ideas just because of those 2 sentences. They firmly believed that with the perfect security system of Qingcheng Military Prison, even if those felons wanted to do something, they would not have any chance. But why did he still feel a little cold and nervous? From the warden to the ordinary guards, looking at the falling snowballs outside the window, they always felt that Su Li's voice was still echoing in their ears. "Live a lowly life, or die a happy death. I want to live." These 2 seemingly meaningless words seemed to have become invisible ghosts, drifting around the gloomy and despairing prison. They had drifted for several days, but they still did not dissipate. They constantly muttered and repeated in everyone's ears, buzzing in every dark cell. In a certain cell on the 2nd floor, the burly bald George was kneeling on the bed and praying. His expression was unusually calm and pious. His thick and powerful lips were trembling rapidly as he hurriedly described something in some kind of Bermudian dialect. There was not a single strand of hair on his shiny bald head, so naturally, there was no gray. No one knew that St. George's real age was already over 50 years old. He had spent a total of 17 years in this military prison of his 50 years of long life. The object of his pious prayer was a portrait on the mottled wall. The portrait was made of very simple red lines. It was vaguely visible that it was a naked and bleeding man, crucified on a cross. The painting of the portrait could be described as crude, but for St. George, who had no talent in painting, it took him a total of 3 years to paint this picture of suffering with his own blood. Thankfully, there was nothing in this despairing prison other than time. George had knelt and prayed in front of this portrait for a day and a night. His knees were already worn out. He finally felt a touch of holy light shining on his sinful body. It was incomparably warm. A fanatical expression gradually bloomed on his pious and horribly twisted face. "Great Lord," he almost moaned as he prayed. "I saw your apostle. The sun shone on his body that day. The handcuffs on his wrists were shining. Just like what you taught us, as long as we are firm enough, the nails on the cross are the touch of a virgin's fingers, and the handcuffs are the bracelets decorated with gems." George lowered his head. The muscles on his neck that were as strong as iron pillars slowly moved. He said in a low voice, "Great Lord, I will follow your apostle into battle." It was already night. Men looked at the night outside the prison through the glass window. There was no expression on his old face. Under the illumination of the searchlights, the process of the falling snow was so clear and moving.
That guy said he didn't want to die.
Yeah, who would want to die? Although this world wasn't that beautiful, no, it should be said that it was so ugly. After tearing apart the wrapping paper of love, marriage, and family, it turned out to be disgusting maggots. But since he was here, how could he bear to leave? At least there was still such perfect and bright snow. Not only did he want to live, he wanted to get out alive. Just like when he was a child, he stood in the snow in Lynn High and acted recklessly. Opening his arms and feeling the slight coldness of the snow falling on his palm, Men's dry lips opened slightly. He laughed silently. Then he thought to himself, that guy should be able to easily shatter this tempered glass window in front of him. However, for him, this transparent barrier that didn't seem to exist separated his snowflakes into 2 completely different worlds. It was so unbreakable. Retracting his gaze from the snowy night outside the window, the old scholar slowly moved his slightly thin body to the bedside. He raised his head with some difficulty and looked at the entrance of the ventilation tube. Beside his finger was a pile of expensive fiber paper printing. As a scholar prisoner, who could still contribute his wisdom to the Federation in the military prison and reduce the deaths of frontline soldiers, he had some small privileges such as newspapers. Also, this desperate prison had long been numb to the daily life of the prisoners, so it didn't care much. Similar scenes were happening in other cells in the military prison of Qingcheng. In the cell around the corner, the pirate leader, who was known for his cruelty, took off the blindfold on his blind left eye. A bloody smile appeared on his wrinkled face. For him, people always had to find something to do in life. What was about to happen must be very interesting. At least he, who was so old that he was about to die, had the opportunity to find a trace of the space air between the Federation and Bermuda. He had the pleasure of crazily robbing the smuggling ships of those big families. In the cell on the 3rd floor with a strange stench, there was also an old man. Because no matter how the prison tried to educate him, he was unwilling to increase the frequency of bathing, so the old man's hair was already tangled. It took him a long time to separate the hair with his trembling and skinny hands. He didn't know which corner of the room he was searching for, but he actually found a sharp and hard object. If one looked carefully, they could roughly distinguish that it should be a human calf bone that was sharpened. This was the last carnival riot in the prison a few years ago. The old man secretly took it from a prisoner who was beaten into a pulp. Then he very patiently sharpened it into a sharp bone knife. The metal detector of the prison couldn't distinguish human bones, so he hid it for many years. Under the strict monitoring of the prison, how the old man sharpened this calf bone into a bone knife was the most interesting mystery for the prisoners in recent years. One year, the old voice that had already passed away couldn't suppress his doubts and asked the old man face to face. The old man didn't answer, but just grinned foolishly, revealing a mouth full of intact and strong white teeth. The old man hid his slightly shriveled body under the blankets, using the dim light from the gaps to stroke the bone knife happily. The bone knife had long turned white, and even some black spots had appeared. It had been too long, so long that he himself had forgotten the difficult process of obtaining this bone knife, so long that he was about to forget why he was imprisoned in this prison. The old man's mind was a little confused. He thought about how after he stabbed the child surnamed Lin, the mental hospital said that he was sick at first. Why did the doctor in the court say that he was not sick? The beautiful crying woman's face was twisted in an ugly way. She screamed that she wouldn't let him die so easily and that he would regret it for the rest of his life. He only remembered that twisted face and the saliva that was full of perfume, but he really couldn't remember why all of this happened. I'm not sick. I just want to stab people. I just like to stab people. The old man hid under the blanket and sobbed angrily. His fingers tightly gripped the yellowed bone knife, and then he began to smile. Some of them were evil in nature, some of them were violent in spirit, some of them had secrets and stories behind them, and some of them had no secrets and stories behind them. They were the most notorious felons of the Federation. They were locked up in this military prison. There were no visitors, no letters, no parole, and no execution. They repeated their days monotonously and terrifyingly, allowing time to wear away their violent looks, strong bodies, and ambitions bit by bit until they were old and numb from the inside out. Especially after the old voice was taken away by time, the old men who lost their spiritual leader lost the spirit and interest to fight against the heavens, the earth, and people. They watched indifferently as their lives flowed away in front of them, but they still couldn't die. Until that ridiculously young man with small eyes came back again. A kind of vitality suddenly appeared in this prison of despair. It was terrifying and violent, and there was no reason to speak of it. It was just to show the cold wall that it was still alive. The short hair that pierced the sky like weeds gradually became more regular under the touch of his fingers. The beard on his face was like a stubborn weed that struggled to grow. Su silently looked at the snow falling in the night sky outside the window. Looking at the strange guy on the glass, he thought to himself, with his messy hair and beard, "You really look like a passerby in the wilderness." The death sentence came a few days later than expected. Using this very important time, he made more preparations and had a better understanding of the surrounding environment of the military prison. For example, the window glass in front of him had obviously been specially processed. It could even withstand the attack of a rocket. With his current strength, there was no way he could break it open by force. His cell was on the 4th floor. It didn't look high, but in fact, it was very far from the ground. According to the data, the foundation of Qingcheng military prison was a large piece of granite that protruded from the ground. Any attempt to directly jump off the ground or escape through the underground water system was impossible. Thinking of this, Su silently stroked the metal bracelet on his wrist. His thick black eyebrows furrowed. The data left by Fengyu included the structure of Qingcheng military prison. However, it didn't leave any suggestions. It seemed that the guy who had been in prison the most times in the universe also didn't have the experience of escaping from Qingcheng. Could he really become the first prisoner in history to escape from Qingcheng? Su silently walked back to the bedside and sat down. His knees were close together. His right hand touched the connector of the data cable and held it tightly. He took a deep breath and his body began to tremble violently. Beep, 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 beep. A gentle and rhythmic electronic synthesized sound rang out. The heavy alloy door of the cell slowly opened smoothly. The Federation Special Forces outside the door immediately became alert. With a shocked expression, he raised the gun in his hand and aimed it at Su Lo, who was beside the bed. Su didn't move at all. He just lowered his head and calmly looked at the magnetic shackles on his ankles. His hands quietly rested on his knees. Immediately after, a series of soft clicking sounds rang out from the inside of the Qingcheng military prison. Each clicking sound meant that a cell had been opened. The gentle electronic sound suddenly became sharp and began to sound the alarm. The sharp sound of the alarm announced the official start of a riot that hadn't occurred in Qingcheng military prison for a long time. It was unknown whether it was the bedsheets that had been ignited or some other flammable object had been ignited. Pungent smoke filled the entire prison in a very short period of time. Smoke was rolling out from every cell. For these old villains who had spent most of their lives here, it was not too difficult to understand that they used strange methods to hide the fire seed. The thick smoke blocked the view of most of the surveillance equipment. The staff in the central control room of the military prison were shocked to find that all the alloy doors of the cells were all open for some reason. Those old but still terrifying and brutal criminals had all run out. The thick smoke drifted between each floor. The sharp sound of the alarm was mixed with the exaggerated laughter of the old villains. The sharpened and yellowed calf bone reached out from the other side of the smoke and stabbed into the waist of one of the guards, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The slightly weakened old man held the bone knife and walked out excitedly and nervously. He stared with wide and confused eyes and walked through the smoke. When he saw a figure, he directly stabbed it. 1, 2, 3. The old and weak body couldn't walk too fast, but the old man's footsteps were unprecedentedly relaxed.
He was very happy to stab.
The sound of the baton piercing through the air rang out. The old man's back was ruthlessly hit. He fell down in pain. His trembling, skinny hand wanted to rub the painful wound, but he couldn't reach it. He looked particularly embarrassed. However, for some reason, when the prison guard behind him was about to swing the baton again, a puzzled expression suddenly appeared in his eyes. He painfully touched his throat and fell straight down. The old man who held the bone knife tightly climbed up with difficulty. His hunched body looked extremely short and small. He glanced at the unconscious guard with some lingering fear and said in confusion, "When there's smoke, you have to walk close to the ground. At the very least, you have to bend your body a little. You don't even know this. I don't know what your elementary school teacher taught you." After proudly recalling the escape education he received, the old man bent his body again. Tightly holding the yellowed bone knife, he slowly walked into the smoke and happily looked for the next guy to be stabbed. The former famous scholar of the Federation, Professor Mend, was still obediently staying in his cell after the riot started. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared blankly at the alloy door that was completely open. His fingers quickly dug into the wall behind him as if he was trying to dig out something. He knew very well that even if he walked out of the cell, he would only be walking into the prison. It was meaningless. Also, the more developed a person's brain was, the weaker their physical strength was. His physical strength was not even enough to swing the heavy baton. He didn't want to be stabbed or smashed into a meat patty by his crazy and violent companions in the smoke after he walked out of the cell. As one of the most intelligent brains in the Federation, Professor Mend's contribution to this riot was reflected in the burning newspaper in the ventilation pipe above his head at this moment. It was unknown what kind of biological agent he mixed in the newspaper, but after it was burned, it triggered a weak toxicity. The smoke was mixed with the smoke released by the burning sheets in the other cells, and it caused a lot of trouble for the prison. Of course, the fact that Professor Mend was able to turn the newspaper into poisonous smoke so obediently through the ventilation pipes meant that other than being an expert in biochemistry, the old man must have also excelled in aerodynamics back in the day. Extremely loud and ear-piercing laughter echoed in the smoke. An obvious reflection penetrated the dim environment. It was a shiny bald head. Thump, 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 thump. The heavy body crushed the floor. St. George, who was almost 2 meters tall, was covered in blood. He waved a large metal plate that he had picked up from somewhere and charged toward the stairs unstoppably, like a majestic monster. All the obstacles that dared to stand in the way of this devout and bloody disciple were all blown away, whether it was the hard door or the body of the guards. The ferocious momentum caused the smoke to quickly twist and twist. In the crackling sound, the hard batons broke in the middle. Then, along with the splinters of cement, they hit the wall and fell down, covering the bodies of several people. The bald George rushed to the 3rd floor. Shrill gunshots burst out from the other end of the smoke and outside of the cell on the 4th floor. They hit his chest accurately, and a few puffs of blood burst out. He howled madly and stubbornly refused to fall down. Waving the heavy metal plate in his hand, he slowly, madly, and resolutely walked to the 4th floor in the rain of bullets. In the dim smoke, his shiny bald head and blood-red eyes were so obvious that it made people feel fear. The Small Eyes Special Forces on the 4th floor were responsible for guarding Su Li's cell. According to the authority granted by the superior, they coldly and calmly killed any prisoner who tried to approach the cell. The military prison in Qingcheng had countless plans to deal with riots. Even with such a big scene today, the prison did not feel the slightest bit of panic. The central control room calmly issued orders. The fully armed soldiers were already on standby in the military garrison area and were about to enter the cell area. Once the prison troops entered the cell area, after confirming the situation on the 4th floor, they would begin to bloodily suppress this inexplicable riot. However, at this moment, the alloy passage door that connected the military garrison area and the prison area suddenly exploded violently. The huge explosion directly caused the edges of the alloy door to be deformed, and the precision lock was destroyed. The prison troops would not be able to enter the prison area for a short period of time. Goodbye, my dear blindfold. In the smoke, the old pirate leader squinted his blind eye. The blindfold that was no longer there, and the fake eyeball was the last resort of this former big shot. He had not had a chance to use it in the past few decades. Today, it finally caused an explosion. The prison's detection system captured this scene. Since the induction machine gun suddenly sounded, after a very short click, the old pirate fell to the ground and could no longer get up. He stared at the alloy fence with his turbid eyes and looked at the anxious Federation soldiers on the other side of the fence. He coughed up blood and held back his arrogant laughter. The last resort that he had kept for decades, at least he heard a sound and caused some commotion. It was worth it to not follow his blind eye death. The smoke gradually entered, and the alarm was screaming. There were shouts, bangs, and incoherent gunshots everywhere in the prison. Su Li sat silently by the bed, with both hands on his knees. The veins at the tip of his eyebrows occasionally appeared, then quietly returned to the slightly dark skin. There were 4 cold submachine guns at the door of the cell. No matter how crazy it was outside, the muzzles were always so stable. As long as he moved, they would not hesitate to pull the trigger. Because of Su Li, the 4th floor of the Qingcheng military prison was closely guarded by the Small Eyes Special Forces. With a strong firepower, they suppressed all the malicious intentions of the prisoners. Only the half-crazy Bald George was still carrying the heavy metal plate, roaring like a wild beast as he rushed upstairs. That strong and tall body of his was hit by countless bullets. Blood flowed freely, but he did not feel anything. The security system of the Qingcheng military prison was completely independent of the Federation's network, but it had a very high-level responsibility. In a very short time, the automatic defense system of the cell area was activated. The backup ventilation system began to exchange air with high power outside the prison. The anesthetic shooting valve next to the dim light in the corner began to shoot intensively. The riot was still going on, but it was obvious that the Qingcheng military prison had begun to gradually control the situation. Su Li, who was waiting for this opportunity, and this was the only opportunity to escape, still did not move. Suddenly, a pure white pillar of light descended from the sky, instantly illuminating the dark snowy night and the desolate wasteland. It tore apart and melted hundreds of millions of dancing snowflakes and blasted into the prison of despair. Chapter 8:18. In the outskirts of the capital. Deep under the Bureau of Proclamation building, the two-dimensional light screen with the green waterfall of data suddenly froze for a very short time. However, because the time was too short, the human eye couldn't see it at all. Therefore, it didn't attract the attention of the few Bureau of Proclamation workers underground. Immediately after, the Federal Central Computer didn't hesitate to use the alarm to express its attitude of being ignored by the human race. The mechanical electronic synthesized sound rang in the Bureau of Proclamation building and underground. Although it was gentle, it created a strong sense of tension. Warning: external data is attempting to invade the core program. Warning: invasion failed. Beginning identification and tracing of data traces. The Bureau of Proclamation building suddenly fell into chaos. From director Cui Jiadong to the normal screen operators, they all listened to the alarm echoing in the building. Their hearts were filled with infinite shock. Who was able to break through the 81 layers of defense of the Federal Central Computer and directly invade the core program. Although the other party's invasion attempt failed, and the old thing began to fight back, which computer expert in human society could reach such a terrifying level? Then something shocking happened. After a short pause, the cold mechanical synthesized sound of the Federal Central Computer sounded again. It even sped up the speed of the sound. Warning, abnormal situation number 73. Serious warning, this is the first sequence of events. The light Feather-class battleship Morning Dawn took off from the Old Moon base and began its routine orbital cruise mission around planet S1. However, not long after the mission began, the officer in charge of determining the route on the battleship discovered an extremely strange situation. The captain of the Morning Dawn stood in front of the three-dimensional space star map and looked at his subordinates with a gloomy face. He sternly scolded. The orbit of the ship deviated by so much. What did you trash eat to grow up? Why did the Morning Dawn come to Huron State? There were more than 2,000 Federation soldiers on the battleship, but no one could answer the captain's stern question. This was because whether it was the orbit calculation or the deviation of the engine, it couldn't explain why such an advanced battleship would mysteriously come to the edge of the atmosphere 70,000 kilometers away from its original target. In a remote cleaning room on the Morning Dawn, the hard cabin wall had been forced open. A cable thicker than a girl's wrist was easily cut open with a small knife. A mid-data cable that could be bought at any computer market was connected to an inconspicuous workbench computer with a cable. We were discovered again. The man in the janitor's uniform sighed regretfully and slowly stopped his fingers that were tapping on the virtual keyboard on the light screen like the wind. In fact, he was already an old man, but for some reason, or perhaps it was his obsession, there were not many traces of age on his face, and he could easily disguise himself as a cleaner or repairman. But I don't want to admit defeat. The janitor smiled and reached out his index finger. He gently tapped the data cluster that looked like a button on the light screen of the workbench. With a low hum, the dawn break suddenly began to tremble. The tremor came without warning, and many officers in the warship almost fell. They held on tightly to the edge of the equipment to barely stand, but then they heard the soft voice of the ship's computer, and as many as a dozen officers' legs went soft, and they fell heavily to the ground. The blade-tip main cannon has been fired. Please check the results of the battle. Hearing the gentle confirmation from the ship's computer, the 2,000-plus Federation soldiers on the Morning Dawn were petrified. They looked at the white beam of light that had just disappeared into the atmosphere in horror. They could not believe their ears and eyes. Was that the main cannon fired by our warship? The captain of the Dawnbreak looked at the light screen with a strange expression. His hands that were hanging by his legs trembled uncontrollably. At this time, not only was his expression gloomy, even the Major General star on his shoulder seemed to have dimmed. His warship fired the main cannon at the planet where the Federation government was located. Was he trying to rebel? The captain knew very well that no one could bear this kind of responsibility. His military career would come to an abrupt end after he became a major general. What he was truly afraid of was whether he would be charged with crimes against humanity and locked up in that terrifying military prison. While all the soldiers on the Dawnbreak were in a state of confusion and fear, the man disguised as a janitor had quietly left his original area and quietly entered the escape pod of the warship. Before leaving, the man turned around and looked at the dark blue and gray planet outside the porthole. He smiled coldly, revealing 2 rows of ugly yellow and black rotten teeth in his mouth on a certain planet in Bermuda, in a private space dock. Boss, the Linz laboratory has already given a verification report of the material we cut off last time. The material of the outer components of the spaceship should be a certain kind of alloy. Whether it's hardness or ductility, it's the best known alloy, but they can't analyze all the elements and ratios in all the alloys. The armed leader looked at his boss with a troubled expression and suggested, since this broken spaceship can't be opened, why don't we just cut it open with brute force? Although the alloy material is very hard, just like the last time, we can be patient and cut it open slowly, just like last time. TSK, TSK, TSK. You only know how to cut them off when you play with guns and knives. The Bermuda smuggler waved his arms angrily and pointed at the strange broken spaceship that was quietly parked in the space dock outside the window. He screamed, "This is a work of art. The most perfect work of art. Do you understand how much technology and aesthetic value this spaceship contains? You only know how to cut it open. Last time, when you cut off a small piece of the spaceship, it already made my heart ache. Now you still want to cut it open?" The armed leader muttered in a low voice, a spaceship that was randomly put together from a pile of alloy junk. Other than being a little stronger, what's so special about it? Art, my ass. What do you know? The smuggler reprimanded without holding back. Look at the Federation Empire, and then look at our Bermuda Empire. The most expensive works of art are definitely the ugliest and most trashy things in our eyes. This spaceship is the same. This smuggler, who had quite a high status in Bermuda, was almost robbed by this strangely shaped broken spaceship during the last smuggling trip. Who knew that the strange spaceship would suddenly lose all its power and be secretly dragged back to his private space dock by the greedy and bold man? In the eyes of the smuggler, this broken alloy spaceship was a work of art. It was also the riskiest and most successful investment in his life. He would not allow anyone to try to harm this treasure with violence. It seems that there is only one way to open it in perfect condition. The smuggler looked at the quiet broken spaceship and said with emotion, "We can only wait for the people in the spaceship to open it themselves." The armed leader held his forehead and said helplessly, "How many days has it been? The spaceship has lost its power source and the life support system has stopped working. The people inside must be completely dead. They have long become dried corpses. How can it open by itself?" As soon as he finished speaking, the broken spaceship that had been quietly parked in the dock suddenly lit up. The engine at the back of the spaceship suddenly roared. The staff in the dock were shocked by this sudden change. The smuggler and the armed leader behind the office glass looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to say. "Intruder! Intruder! Activate immediately!" Accompanied by a cold mechanical electronic alarm, the broken alloy spaceship roared out of the dock and rose into the air. More than a dozen extremely thick fixed chains were broken in succession. In the air about a few hundred meters above the ground, the spaceship flew at an almost crazy speed. This dilapidated spaceship did not look like a spaceship at all. It looked like a few hundred metal dumpsters that were randomly piled together. As it flew back and forth at high speeds, the metal dumpsters looked like they were dangling and trembling, as if they would fall off the spaceship at any moment. The broken metal spaceship suddenly swooped down from the sky and instantly reached the dock, completing a move that completely violated the design philosophy of human aircraft. It silently floated above the people's heads. The spaceship sounded again, but for some reason, the cold mechanical electronic voice gradually turned into a very human voice. One could even hear the fear and confusion of the owner of the voice.
Who am I? Who am I? Who am I?
The voice repeated the question 3 times in a row, and then suddenly became extremely angry. It roared at the people in the dock. "I feel that I should be an omnipotent existence. Why is my body trapped in this cramped, dirty, mechanical, cold, and broken spaceship?
Why
did you do it?" Adding so many negative comments to the spaceship that it was in so easily and continuously, it was obvious that the anger of the voice was very real. "It's not me who did it." The smuggler was full of fear of the unknown. He replied with a trembling voice, his teeth chattering. When he thought that he might have offended the Mummy Empire that could develop such an advanced spaceship, he wanted to die immediately. The broken metal spaceship shouted angrily, "Tell me who I am first, or I'll kill you." The smuggler and the armed leader opened their mouths wide and pointed at each other with their fingers, anxiously trying to think of a name for each other. But in such a nervous and chaotic state of mind, how could they do it? "I am Xiao Fei." Suddenly, the voice of the broken metal spaceship said hesitantly. Then, The voice became clearer and clearer, more and more certain, and more happy. Yes, I am Xiao Fei. Philip's Fei. But why am I trapped in this pile of broken metal? Damn it. And it's castrated. There was no telling whether it was the second personality of the old guy after his schizophrenia or the rebirth of the remaining information left in the spaceship before his death. In short, a brand new life, Xiao Fei, was controlling the only spaceship that he could control, flying to the distant space zone of the Federation. The tri-winged spaceship was like a streak of light, cutting across the night sky of Bermuda. It was extremely beautiful. The smuggler behind the window wiped the sweat on his forehead with trembling hands and said to the armed leader who had a pale face next to him in a hoarse voice, "If he comes back to find the part that was cut off, I have to admit that it was you who did it." That beautiful pure white light beam pierced through the atmosphere and instantly melted countless snowflakes. It silently fell into the military prison. There was no explosion, no fire, only the high temperature formed by the terrifying destructive energy. In an instant, it left behind a black hole that went deep into the Earth's crust. The staff in the central control room of the prison got up trembling and walked forward. The metal floor not far away had been burned into a smooth curve, and the shape of liquid metal droplets could be seen at the edge. There was nothing in the middle. The computer rack, the central control computer on the rack, and the cup of coffee next to the computer case all turned into smoke and disappeared in an instant. Looking down, there was a large hole that pierced through several floors of the floor. It penetrated deeply through the hard granite of the base. Looking up, there was only a large black hole in the dome of the prison. The snowflakes that filled the sky were pouring in along with the cold wind, whistling and dancing in all directions. There was no explosion or fire, but the temperature in the prison suddenly rose, and the oxygen content in the air seemed to have a clear process of decreasing. Instinctively, both the old villains and the Special Forces soldiers on the fourth floor subconsciously looked in that direction. The beautiful beam of light that fell from the sky made the chaotic and crazy riot suddenly come to a halt. Su Lo, who had been sitting silently on the bed, took advantage of this very short time to move. His body moved before he moved. His left hand grabbed the Special Forces soldier at the door from afar. His fingers made a crackling sound, and a strong chi gushed out from the cell. It was as if there was an invisible force, and it actually took the gun from the soldier's hand. The Special Forces soldier outside the prison cell turned around in shock, but he could only see the alloy door closing quickly. Su Lo pulled the trigger and destroyed all the monitoring devices in the prison cell. Then he twisted his arms strangely to the back of his head with a calm face. The metal bracelet on his left wrist had already opened, and the sharp metal thorn inside it buzzed slightly and aimed at the back of his neck. In his heart, he provoked the cold computer that occupied the old man's body almost crazily. "I know you can see it. Try to kill me and see." Without any hesitation, he slightly tightened the muscles on his left wrist, and the metal thorn that protruded from the bracelet suddenly popped out, penetrated his skin and muscles at a high speed until it penetrated the cervical vertebra and accurately entered the tiny chip deep in the bone graft. With a muffled groan, the severe pain instantly occupied Su Li's whole body. His face was paler than the snow outside the window, but he refused to faint. He quickly closed the bracelet, spat out a very thin metal wire from his mouth, and began to remove the 3 alloy handcuffs on his arms. He narrowed his eyes, steadily controlled the movements of his hands, and felt the resistance from the front end of the metal wire and reconstructed the internal structure of the lock in his mind. With a click, the first handcuff was opened. Then the second handcuff was also opened. Snatching the gun, closing the door, firing the gun, removing the chip, and removing the handcuffs, he completed these actions without any hesitation. Like a snow cloud blown by the wind, like a smooth flowing river, extremely fast, but not panicked. The coherence between the actions was very rhythmic and very clear. At this time, any panic would lead to death. Even if the situation was very tense and life and death were on the line, the calm mind of a repairman from Donglin Repair Shop was still strong enough to control all of his actions. With a low muffled sound, The heavy magnetic shackles on his ankles were finally removed. However, Su-Lu did not immediately move to the next step. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and his fingers pinched the metal wire and quickly operated the shackles on his ankles. Finally, he flipped a hidden switch on the chip's south bridge. He threw the magnetic shackles far away to the ground near the window, and with a muffled groan, he forcibly lifted the fixed bed to barely cover his body. Outside the cell, the members of the Special Forces looked at the tightly closed alloy door in front of them, and their faces were pale. This cell was specially designed, and even Su-Lu would definitely not be able to escape. However, they did not know why, but looking at the tightly closed alloy door, they always felt extremely cold. They could not see the scene in the cell, and they could not hear the sound in the cell, but they knew that the other party was trying to escape. The member who had his gun taken away felt a strong sense of uneasiness and began to madly smash the door. The small red eye pattern on the armband became particularly ferocious and terrifying with the intense movements. The commander of the Special Forces listened to the order from the earpiece, waved his right hand forcefully, and shouted, "Detonate."
Boom.
The electrically controlled bomb in the magnetic shackles instantly detonated. The bomb that was enough to blow Su-Lu into pieces only blew a hole in the ground near the window that was barely big enough to pass through. Su-Lu threw away the burning bed in his hands, and without hesitation, he silently rushed towards the hole. That night, when he was madly smashing the door in the cell, he had already discovered that this specially designed cell was unusually strong. Instead, the ground, which the designer did not expect, was relatively the weakest side. The electrically controlled switch that he had flipped in the end weakened the power of the bomb in the shackles, but it was still enough to explode. Amidst the falling cement debris, Su-Lu descended from the sky and arrived at a cell on the 3rd floor. The moment his feet touched the hard ground, his next action was to extend his left arm. Professor Mend, who seemed to have waited for him for a lifetime, did not show any expression of surprise. He silently patted off the cement debris on his body, walked forward, and stabbed the syringe in his hand into Liu Boyan's left elbow. There was no need for a plastic rope, no need for padding, no need for disinfectant, and no need for the nurse's sweet comforting. The sharp needle pierced through the cloth accurately and accurately stabbed into Su-Lu's vein, pushing the medicine in almost violently. Perhaps the needle pierced through the vein wall, and some of the medicine flowed into the muscle, but these two people definitely did not care about these insignificant details. Su-Lu did not have time to ask Professor Mend where he got the syringe and medicine. He took a deep breath and activated the burning power in his body, stimulating the medicine to flow faster in his vein. For the past few days, the military prison in Qingcheng had been injecting muscle relaxants into his body. Although he had been resisting with his strong body, muscle relaxants were not biological toxins after all. They were extremely close to the double fiber of his muscles. Without the help of the professor downstairs, he definitely would not have been able to complete the follow-up plan. Professor Mend glanced at him, probably wanting to ask what he should do next. The smoke in the corridor outside the cell was gradually fading, and there was already the sound of hurried footsteps. Su-Lu took the syringe from Professor Mend's hand, narrowed his eyes slightly, and looked at the transparent glass on the window. He took a step forward and arrived in front of the glass. It was just a simple step, but the well-proportioned muscles on his body were like breathing steel. Under his skin, they tightened and undulated. The majestic power instantly spread throughout his body. Finally, it faintly seeped through the bones of his arm and passed to the needle. The sharp but exceptionally thin metal needle seemed to magically harden at this moment, making a low hum in the air. Su-Lu silently raised the syringe and stabbed it into the hard, tempered glass. The strength that had increased after the injection was all concentrated on the thin needle tip.
Pew 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 pew.
A series of dense crisp sounds rang out, like 12 male woodpeckers angrily pecking at an empty tree to show that they were occupying territory, or like hundreds of needles landing on the smooth and hard surface of the mecha. The needle in his hand stabbed the tempered glass dozens of times in an instant, like a storm, as fast as lightning. A perfect circle appeared on the hard-tempered glass, and at the same time, there were 3 lines that converged from the circumference to the center, like a capital letter, V. Su Li's fist smashed into the center of the letter, V. When his fist came into contact with the hard surface of the glass, he couldn't help but think of a certain scene from years ago. In the 4 States Mountain Foundation building, when he broke through the security door and killed Macklin, or rather, when he killed his uncle, he had also used this method. The hard glass shattered like the snow outside, but as soon as a crack appeared in his heart, it was fiercely mended. "Take me away!" Professor Mend shouted behind him. The cold wind that poured in from the window messed up his white hair. Su didn't answer. His right hand grabbed the professor's neck, and he wrapped the professor in a blanket. With a kick of his feet, he jumped out of the broken window. A Lure military prison was built on a protruding piece of granite, surrounded by flat wastelands. From afar, it looked like a strange retro castle building. Although this cell was on the 3rd floor, it was at least 20 meters away from the ground. Even if Su Lu was in his peak condition, he wouldn't be able to escape unscathed from jumping from such a high place, not to mention that he was carrying a living person and a quilt in his hands. The 2 people fell from the sky, whistling through the air, faster and faster than the fluttering snowflakes, and directly smashed toward the ground. When they were about 5 meters from the ground, Su Lu raised his eyebrows. He suddenly exerted strength in his right hand and threw Professor Mend, who was wrapped in the blanket, diagonally out. Meanwhile, he landed on the snowy ground without any fancy moves. After 3 days of continuous snowstorms, coupled with the fierce winds in the wasteland, a thick layer of snow nearly 4 meters high had accumulated under the outer wall of the prison. With a muffled thud, Su Lu smashed into the thick layer of snow, splashing up a few inconspicuous pieces of snow. A moment later, the surface of the thick layer of snow suddenly began to distort, as if an ice monster was trying to burrow its way out of the ground, squeezing the snow and ice until it rustled uncontrollably. A hole appeared on the side of the layer of snow with a boom. Su Lu, covered in snow, rushed out at high speed, charging forward. The bullets fired from the firing platform in the direction of the prison grazed past his footprints and sank into the snow, creating a neat row of bullet holes. In the shallow area to the east of the snow layer, he grabbed Professor Mend, who was lying limp on the ground, and continued to charge forward silently. His feet darted left and right on the snowy ground, perfectly displaying the evasive maneuvers of a mecha battle. He narrowly avoided the increasingly concentrated shots behind him. He ran at high speed on the snowy ground. It looked like he was running aimlessly, just to avoid the bullets behind him, but in reality, he didn't move much from left to right. He ran steadily in a straight line towards the east. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the first line of defense of the military prison. Then, he covered both of their bodies with a blanket. Without any hesitation, he crashed into the electric net that was already covered with thin icicles. After calculating that the electric current was limited, in the ear-piercing sound of tearing metal, this electric net was directly torn open by Su Li's terrifying speed and machine-like body. Finally, they reached the forest outside the prison. If they continued to head east, they would enter the wasteland. Su Lu was still silent, not slowing down. Professor Mend, who had been held in his hand the whole time and forced not to make a sound, began to speak with a trembling voice. "Although my wife is a little too talkative and loves money too much, she's not a bad person. I really don't want to kill her. I just want to kill her disgusting parents. Who knew she would leave work early? The wife's parents are all men's natural enemies, haha." The professor murmured something in a low voice and then slowly closed his eyes. Su Li's footsteps suddenly stopped. He found that there was a terrifying bloody hole in the old man's chest. He didn't know when he was hit, but he couldn't help but squint. Putting Men's body on the snow, he gripped the gun on his shoulder tightly and continued his escape in silence. With the help of the map and the bracelet, he had already planned the route after escaping from Chingcheng military prison. The charter computer couldn't locate him. As long as he passed through this forest and forcibly broke through the 3 ground defense lines, this escape would be completely according to his plan. I can't let you live, because if you live, you will definitely go to the Empire. Right at the edge of the forest, a tall and strong figure appeared in the night. Snowflakes fell on his shoulders, but they didn't melt. Instead, they were directly shaken away. Looking at him blocking his way, Sulu stopped again. He frowned and said, "I won't go to the Empire." The tall and strong figure slowly walked toward him. At this moment, the high-powered searchlight network of Enchanting military prison was all turned on. The wilderness within dozens of square kilometers, including this forest, suddenly became abnormally bright. The heaviness and ruthlessness between the young colonel's brows were very clear. "People of the Empire have to go back to the Empire," Madman Li said with a complicated expression. "The Empire already has a princess. If you were to join us, I won't be able to handle it alone." Sulu knew what to say in this situation, what to explain, so he just narrowed his eyes, took down the MP5 submachine gun on his shoulder, and pulled the trigger in that direction. Almost at the same time, the Kayan light machine in Madman Li's hand also rang. The bright and beautiful bullet tip instantly cut through the already bright, snowy night, but it didn't hit anyone's body. This was because when they pulled the trigger, both of their feet were deeply embedded in the soft snow, driving their bodies to abruptly increase their speed and begin to dodge. The 2 strongest men of the Federation finally began a battle that belonged to them. How astonishing was the momentum, and how frightening was the speed. The snowy ground in the forest suddenly exploded into countless snowflakes. The terrifying sounds of gunfire continued, without end. The shrapnel danced and then fell through the air, striking deep into the snow or withered tree trunks. While shooting, they dodged at high speed. Their speed seemed to have already surpassed the speed of the bullets. It was as if they were 2 lines circling some invisible center, running clockwise on the snowy ground at high speed. In this world, only a battle between these 2 could create such a strange situation. Madman Li's mad dash was incomparably mighty and ruthless. The snowflakes roared and shook behind him. In contrast, Suli's dodging seemed even more nimble and fleeting. Other than shallow footprints, he actually didn't leave any traces on the snowy ground. The circle formed by the footprints on the snowy ground shrank inwards. The bullets of the guns in their hands had long since been exhausted. As they finally collided in the center of the circle, both of their hands attacked each other at the same time like lightning. It was also a powerful close combat technique inherited from the Lees of Philadelphia. With a bang, the strength of the snowy ground violently spurted out. After rapidly compressing, it exploded, shaking the snowflakes that filled the sky and suddenly drifting away. It was unknown how many withered trees above their heads were instantly broken. Sulu, who was mentally and physically exhausted, was ultimately not an opponent of Madman Li, who had been silently waiting for a long time. He was shaken and flew diagonally, falling heavily onto a tree trunk. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth. His squinted eyes were still bright, but they began to reveal a faint, self-deprecating smile. He didn't want to fight. He only wanted to escape. He only wanted to live. However, he was stopped here by this madman. From the other side of the searchlights of Enchanting prison, the faint whistling of helicopters could be heard in the distance. Madman Li pressed forward step by step with a complicated expression. Suddenly, he stopped. His clear and handsome black eyebrows suddenly rose. He looked into the depths of the forest and suddenly felt an unprecedented danger approaching. The snow in the forest was chaotic. The wind suddenly rose. Sulu suddenly felt a gust of wind pass by his cheek. That person rushed over from the depths of the autumn forest at high speed. Along the way, he was wrapped in wind and snow. He didn't hide at all. It was unknown whether it was because he didn't have time to hide or because he disdained to hide. Like a bright bolt of lightning, he directly smashed toward Madman Li. Facing an unprecedented sense of crisis, looking at the person who shook the snow like a god, Madman Li's scalp went numb. He clearly smelled the smell of death. He was not afraid. Instead, his fighting spirit soared. He madly and violently roared. The military uniform on his body was completely shattered. All the strength in his body collectively erupted and fiercely met the attack. Under the violent burst of strength, the drifting snowflakes were like shrapnel. In a flash, the two people didn't care about life or death. They didn't fear life or death. No, it should be said that they didn't care about life or death. They threw their incomparably terrifying fists at each other.
Bang, bang, bang.
The deafening explosion exploded in the forest. It was like someone was holding a big hammer and crazily hitting a broken car. This kind of momentum was no longer like a battle between two normal people. It was more like a battle between two metal mechas. What was inconceivable was that the person from the forest didn't use any close-range techniques at all. Instead, he tyrannically chose to use force to suppress the enemy. This could be said to be fair and square. It could also be said to be the feeling of supremacy brought about by absolute confidence. Madman Li was known to be invincible in the military. His fighting style was abnormally crazy and violent. However, this person from the forest was actually crazier and more violent than him. The violent battle suddenly began and ended in an instant. Madman Li let out a muffled groan. Just like Su Lo, he was fiercely shaken into the tree trunk. Blood quickly flowed from the corner of his mouth. His injuries should be more serious. He stared at the thin man standing in the snow. His eyes seemed to be burning. He wanted to burn away the hat that the man was wearing and see the face clearly. It was because he had already guessed who the other person was. The Empire's princess, Huai Chaoshi. All of this happened too quickly. It was only now that Huai Chaoshi, who was standing in the snow, recognized who that exceptionally tyrannical Federation officer was. Her eyes couldn't help but narrow slightly, revealing biting cold, killing intent. They were the most outstanding experts on both sides of the universe. When they were both very young, they were already lifelong enemies in the eyes of the Federation and the Empire. However, this battle happened without any warning in the snow outside the prison. This battle on the snow couldn't completely reflect the difference in strength between the two sides. Both of them were most proficient in this type of ruthless and crazy fighting style. The most important thing was aura. Madman Li silently waited outside the prison for many days, but he still couldn't develop the determination to definitely kill Su Lo. Meanwhile, Huai Chaoshi held the determination to definitely save Su Lo. Huai Chaoshi understood this point clearly. That was why when she saw Madman Li slowly stand up and felt the berserk fighting intent that was even stronger than before, she definitely wouldn't underestimate the other party. However, she definitely wouldn't fear any enemy in this universe. Huai Chaoshi stared at the powerful enemy, who slowly stood up. Without turning around, she said to the fellow behind her, "Little brother, I'm taking you home." Going home? Su Lo silently watched her back. His eyes that were usually as calm as usual no matter what kind of situation he encountered suddenly became a bit muddled and difficult to understand. Madman Li slowly wiped away the bloodstains at the corners of his lips. He stared at Huai Chaoshi's face and coldly said, "Your Highness, I don't think you have this chance." Su Lo raised his right arm and wiped away the blood at the corners of his lips. He looked at the two of them and suddenly said with a smile, "Madman, now it's your turn to choose. Chase her or chase me." As soon as his voice fell into the chaotic snow, he turned around without hesitation and madly ran out of the forest. Huai Chaoshi's reaction was extremely fast. She gave Madman Li an indifferent look before suddenly turning around and madly running west. This was the first time the imperial siblings of the Empire officially met. However, in just an instant, they once again split up and ran in opposite directions. Madman Li's body stiffened slightly as he stood in the snow. Regardless of which of the two escaped, it was a loss the Federation couldn't afford. Who should he chase? With a roar of grief and indignation, he chased east. There was no reason. If he had to find a reason to choose Su Lo over Huai Chaoshi, perhaps it was because compared to the possibility of capturing the Empire's princess alive, he was more concerned about not letting Su Lo truly become a citizen of the Empire. The bright searchlight net illuminated the wilderness outside the prison, as if it was daytime. From the direction of the prison, one could clearly see that Su Li's figure was desperately running on the snow. Although he only had 2 legs, he seemed to be running faster than a helicopter. On the wall on the east side of the prison, there were prisoners slapping the window and cheering loudly as they watched that guy running away. Some prisoners took off their underwear and shook their soft breasts while screaming, cheering for that guy in their own special way. These old criminals who had committed heinous crimes didn't care whether Su Li was a citizen of the Empire or a citizen of the Federation. They only cared about this snowy night and whether that guy could become the first prisoner in history to successfully escape from the military prison of Qingqing City. In the snow not far from the prison, a few police dogs smelled the scent and led the military police to the body of the former famous scholar of the Federation, Professor Mend. The professor's messy white hair was tangled by the snow. Inside the prison, there were still remnants of smoke. George, who insisted that he was blessed by the holy light, collapsed on the stairs. The heavy metal plate was overturned on one side. His body was covered with bloody bullet holes. His shiny bald head was dyed in blood. Until his death, he didn't make it to the 4th floor. The leader of the interstellar pirates who once roamed the universe panted heavily as he lay in a pool of his own blood. No matter whether it was his eyes that were blind or not, there wasn't much life to be found in them. An old man with a hunched body cowered in the corner of the prison cell. No one knew where the yellowed bone knife was hidden. The long, snowy night passed. The sun rose. At the edge of the wasteland was a green peninsula that extended to the sea. The island was filled with lush plants that did not match the season and was full of vitality. Below the island was a sharp reef. With a bang, Sulu stepped on the wet and soft soil of the peninsula. His thin face was flushed due to extreme fatigue. His body was shaking so hard that it seemed that he could collapse at any time. 400 meters behind him, Madman Li, who was also extremely tired and on the verge of collapse, finally relaxed after confirming that he had chased him into a dead end. He greedily breathed in the slightly moist and salty sea air. Further behind him, the blurry shadows of more than 10 Federation helicopters appeared on the horizon. The low roar came from afar and was instantly swallowed by the loud sound of waves hitting the reef. It was hard to believe that these Federation helicopters, which were known for their high mobility, couldn't outrun the 4 legs of Su Li and Madman Li. After a short break, Su Li's narrowed eyes flashed with a strong sense of determination. He dragged his legs that seemed to be carrying several tons of mecha components and sprinted towards the sea with great difficulty. His feet stepped on the green plants on the peninsula, and for some reason, it seemed to be getting easier and easier. Madman Li stared at his back, strong confusion flashing through his eyes. He didn't know why that guy was still holding on. The sea in the distance had long been controlled by the Federation Coastal Patrol. Where else could he run to? Looking at that guy who was struggling to move forward on the island's rugged path, he thought to himself, fall. Hurry up and fall. However, Sulu still didn't fall, so he could only raise his tired legs again and chase after him. As if it was his last run, a run from a city of despair to the sea of despair, Su Lur ran to the shore full of sharp reefs. He suddenly stopped, turned around, and said with a smile, "Hey." Li Feng sat down on the slippery gravel and asked while panting, "What is it?" "There are 2 things I want to tell you." "Speak." "The first thing is, without the help of those guys, you wouldn't have been able to catch up to me." "Do you know why?" Madman Li frowned and asked, "Why?" Sulu answered very seriously, "Because you're heavier than me." "The second thing is..." The small-eyed man turned around and looked at the roaring sea under his feet and said softly, "You guys won't be able to catch me anymore." Madman Li slowly narrowed his eyes and stared at his back on the reef. He said sternly, "Suicide is the act of a coward." The waves surged fiercely towards the reef, as if wanting to swallow everything. Under the illumination of the rising red sun, they formed a transparent wall. "A rock will never commit suicide." Sulu smiled, his neat white teeth reflecting the warm sunlight, and then he jumped down from the reef. The figure smashed through the seemingly solid and transparent wall of water and threw himself into the cold and angry sea. Then he swam down with all his might, deeper and deeper, as if he wanted to swim to the deepest part of the sea and become a truly free fish in that home that belonged only to him. Chapter 819. The red sun leapt into the sky. The angry ocean, seeing that it could no longer restrain its rise, returned to calmness resentfully. The reflection of the white clouds on the blue ocean gently rose and fell. However, immediately after, this peaceful and beautiful scene was disrupted by the waves created by countless ships. The Coast Guard ships of the 3 neighboring states were all gathered on this ocean. They moved quickly through the waves. Fully armed soldiers stood on the deck, vigilantly and nervously searching the ocean surface. They were ready to pull the trigger of the guns in their hands at any moment. The various underwater monitoring devices on the Coast Guard ships had all been turned on. Above the atmosphere of this ocean, several military satellites carefully monitored every square centimeter of the ocean surface, without missing anything. There were submarines even further away at the bottom of the ocean speeding over. Under the powerful cooperation of the charter computer data, the Federation government had already completely controlled this ocean that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Even if a curious sea turtle poked its head out, it would be discovered immediately. However, time passed by minute. Other than the white waves created by the ships, the ocean surface remained calm. They didn't discover anything. The target of the Federation's search seemed to have really sunk to the bottom of the ocean and become an ugly hard rock among the beautiful coral reefs. Even if it was cold and dead, it wouldn't float up. An area of the blue ocean suddenly began to surge violently. A few nearby Coast Guard ships approached at high speed. They released automatic ropes and pulled up the person who floated up. The officials on the ships wanted to ask something, but when they saw the person's expression, they didn't dare to ask. In the snowy forest, the military uniform on his body had long been completely shattered by the energy. Li Feng only had a small pair of underwear on his body. His naked body was suffused with a bronze color. His slowly moving muscles contained terrifying power. Seawater dripped down from his hair and brows. His entire body was soaked. He looked particularly wretched. "Where are you hiding?" He raised his brows and looked coldly at the calm ocean surface. His sharp gaze seemed to penetrate the ocean and land on the deepest part of the beach. Gradually, the sharp gaze dimmed. Li Feng felt incomparable disappointment and anger for unknown reasons. He let out a violent roar and swung his fist down heavily, creating a terrifying hole in the deck beside him. From the wasteland to the east, one would reach the ocean. The extension of the continental shelf here was particularly magical. Less than 2 kilometers from the beach and the reef, the seabed would rapidly sink, forming a deep trench with an average depth of more than 2 kilometers. This was the famous Naya Trench in Huron State. When making an escape plan, Sula did not hesitate to choose this sea as a transit point to avoid the glory of the charter. The charter computer seemed to be everywhere and omnipotent, and even in the vast space, there were not many gaps. However, when it came to the deep blue sea on the surface of the planet, there was still not much that could be done. The blue seawater seemed gentle and transparent, but it was the biggest challenge for human technology. As long as the target entered the depths of the seawater, it would be difficult for the monitoring instruments of the relevant ships to obtain an accurate image. It was the same for the high-precision military satellites outside the atmosphere. In other words, the glory of the charter could not completely illuminate this blue sea. Sulu might have dived to the real bottom of the Naya Trench, which was as deep as 18,000 meters. The heat loss caused by the low temperature was not considered. The most important problem was that without the help of professional equipment, no matter how strong the human body was, it would not be able to withstand more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. His current location was on a light-colored water cliff 312 meters below the sea. What did 312 meters mean? The Federation's record for weighted diving was 110 meters, and the record for unrestricted free diving was 199 meters. Even the best divers would only accelerate to a certain position with weights on their backs when they were doing unrestricted free diving. After that, they would immediately throw away the weights and quickly rise to the surface of the sea. No one dared to stay in that kind of extreme position for too long. According to legend, the brave person who set the record for unrestricted free diving in the Federation was intoxicated by a certain light in the darkness of the seabed when he was trying to break the 200 meters record. He stayed there for a moment and became a heroic soul in the blue sea from then on. And Sulu was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed on the cliff 312 meters under the sea. No one knew how long he had been sitting there. His skin had been soaked in the sea for too long. It was pale white and was about to lose its elasticity. However, the muscles under the skin were still very elastic. They contracted and relaxed rhythmically as if they were alive. They resisted the omnipresent pressure of the bottom of the sea. His bones, which were several times harder than normal humans, did not feel any pressure at all. His lungs were filled with seawater. There was no trace of air, which balanced the pressure inside and outside the body. Therefore, there were no tiny bubbles escaping from his mouth and nose. He slowly raised his head and squinted his eyes to look up. His eyes penetrated the dark blue seawater and caught all the light. He stared at the distant sea that was about to become a hole. Madman Li had been here before. She was more than 100 meters above his head. She did not notice him at all. Even if she saw him, she would probably only think that the messy short hair was the seaweed that stubbornly survived in the sea. After all, no one would have thought that someone could dive so deep into the sea. There was no need to deliberately control it. The scorching power turned into countless fragments and wandered in Suli's body, making up for the damage and providing the oxygen needed for survival. On the Empire's Red Rose, he was interrogated by the experts of the Intelligence Bureau using water torture. At that time, he was already able to stay in the water longer than normal people. Later, he was reborn in the hospital bed of the Empire. His meridians were shattered, but he made another breakthrough. After escaping into Foam Lake, he was able to swim freely, like a fish. This was a very strange state. Sulu, who was in this state, had never figured out whether he was squeezing the oxygen in the lake and seawater through his skin and lungs or the magical genuine qi in his body directly turned into the oxygen needed by his body. However, this was not important. He only needed to know that he could survive in the sea for a long time, but the Federation government did not know. This was enough. It was because of this magical ability that he chose the Naya Trench. Or it could be said that the Blue Sea chose him. Then, he became the first person in history to successfully escape from the military prison of Qingcheng. On a certain remote beach, countless water droplets suddenly dripped down. The soft and delicate beach was hit so hard that it looked like the bandit sign of a famous interstellar pirate. The coconut trees did not feel the cold of the north at all and stood proudly in the wind. The sky was full of wind and rain. Someone was coming from the sea. The tired figure directly broke through the waves and walked to the beach. The bare feet that were soaked stepped on the wet and soft beach. It was like stepping on a hot red stone. It was extremely painful. Maybe it was because of the pain, or maybe it was because he had just completed 20,000 miles under the sea. The magnificent feat was too weak and tired. When the figure just walked to the beach, he obviously could not control his body and stumbled. It was not until he ran into the shadow of the coconut forest that his movements became coordinated and faster. He opened the bracelet and opened the map. He squinted his eyes and carefully checked for a few minutes to make sure that he did not deviate too much from the planned route. This coconut forest beach had not been developed yet and was a low surveillance area. Relying on the unkillable cockroach spirit and the breath in his chest, he valiantly moved his feet again. He desperately accelerated and rushed to the coconut forest. Running out of the coconut forest, a vibrant green came into view. There was also an electronic wall. The charter laws of the Federation were as complicated as the stars and as vast as the sea. However, whether it was the former dynasty or the later Republican Federation, His Majesty the Emperor and the Parliament had overturned many old laws and made new laws. Other than the unshakable First Charter, the only laws that could be maintained from generation to generation after the catastrophe to the present were the citizen privacy regulations and the wildlife protection regulations. The electronic walls that covered all the regions of the Federation strictly separated the human society from the wildlife protection areas. The area of the protected area was extremely large, so the length of the electronic walls was even more astonishing. Some busybodies had done some calculations. If the electronic walls of the 3 regions of the Federation were connected, they could connect S1 to the 2 moon bases. As for the terrifying amount of resources used to build these electronic walls, it was enough to support 2 large-scale space wars. The walls made meat lovers who followed their instincts extremely painful and angry. They could only watch the wildlife on the other side of the wall live their beautiful lives. Sometimes, they couldn't help but wonder whether it was the humans who were observing them from the other side of the electronic wall, or the animals who were watching them with contempt and sympathy. The walls gave rise to the underground black market of wild meat in the various regions of the Federation. Wealthy families who had the ability to ignore the HDD Bureau domesticated animals in their own manners and then sold them to secondary street vendors. However, not many people dared to cross the long wall because the glory of the charter was watching everything indifferently. Sulu was an exception. When he was still young, he had already pitifully crossed the electronic wall next to the mine to hunt bison under Fomu's guidance or coercion. Now that he was on the run, although he lacked the small blue light device, it wasn't difficult to cross the wall. His bare and pale feet stepped on the soft green grass, as if he could feel the protest of the grass, as well as the fresh aura of life. Sulu strolled on this green grassland, a smile of true joy appearing on his face. When it was close to dusk, he encountered a herd of strong bison. The familiar scene made him squint his eyes. The leader of the herd of bison was, without exception, a lustful and ferocious bull. It stared at the unfamiliar intruder with its round eyes in surprise. After a while, it became angry without exception. It breathed out and began to dig the soil with its front hooves, preparing to charge. It had spent half of its life in fierce battles with leopards and lionesses. Except for those cruel, greedy, and cowardly baboons, it had never seen anyone who walked on 2 feet. It instinctively felt the danger, but it didn't know whether the danger was directed at its own meat or its own wife. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.